The story of the Ancelotti crime family begins in the year 1908, when 34-year-old Gioacchino Ancelotti would immigrate to the borough of Algonquin, Liberty City, with his 26-year-old wife, Allegra Ancelotti, and their children Giacomo, Aldolfo, Pietro, Alessia, and Giuliana. Gioacchino Ancelotti, an Italian immigrant from Naples, Italy, would settle with his family in February of 1908 in an apartment at the corner of Columbus Avenue and Emerald Street in the rough Lower East Algonquin neighborhood, known as Lower Easton. Ancelotti, who came from a large and notorious family in Napoli that was known to be heavily involved in the mafia, had become a successful wine distributor around Italy during the 1890s, and by 1909, Ancelotti, alongside his illegitimate brother Joe Cozzo, would develop a successful liquor importing company based out of the fish market North Harbor, known as Cozzo Imports. Ancelotti, whose father and uncles were all members of the mafia in Napoli, would during this time establish himself as a legitimate American businessman, distancing himself from his family's tradition of crime back in Napoli and striving to get his shot at the American dream. By 1910, Gioacchino's son, 14-year-old Giacomo Ancelotti, would begin working for his father's importing company, and Gioacchino would instill these integral values in his son at work. During this era, in the year 1910, many of the working-class lower Algonquin neighborhoods were experiencing a massive surge of Italian immigration. In Suffolk, which was a neighboring section of Algonquin directly to the west of Lower Easton, several Italian mafia groups had begun to form and were quickly becoming known in the area. On Columbus Avenue and around the Lower Easton neighborhood, another mafioso from Napoli would begin to assert himself over the area, Gaetano the Man Violante. Gaetano Violante, who had immigrated to Columbus Avenue in 1895, had taken a stronghold of Columbus Avenue from Hematite Street all the way down to Calcium Street, and Violante was known to control the surrounding Lower East Side neighborhoods. Violante, who was a ruthless gangster, was known to shake down and extort the residents of the Lower East Side and strike fear into the streets of Algonquin. Violante, who had been responsible for dozens of murders in Liberty City since his immigration, was by 1910 leading a gang of Italian criminals in and around Columbus Avenue. This gang, known as the Columbus Avenue Gang, was involved in extortion, theft, robbery, fencing, drug trafficking, and sex trafficking, and was known to commit murder at the drop of a hat. In the Lower East Side, Violante was immensely feared, and it was known in the area that those who would dare to cross Violante and the Columbus Avenue Gang would very likely come to meet a violent death. By 1912, Gaetano Violante, who was known in Lower Easton simply as the Man, would gain a stronghold over the Algonquin fish market, extorting the various fish and seafood companies, as well as import companies that operated out of the docks. Soon, Violante would begin to shake down and extort Gioacchino Ancelotti and his company, Cozzo Imports. Ancelotti, who by this point was a legitimate businessman who had abandoned his connections to organized crime, would subsequently elect to pay extortion money to Violante and respect the order in the streets of Algonquin. By 1913, Gioacchino Ancelotti would develop a major drinking problem, and as a result, Cozzo Imports would by this time be run primarily by Ancelotti's 17-year-old son Giacomo, as well as Gioacchino's brother, Joe Cozzo. The young Giacomo Ancelotti, who was known for his intelligence and work ethic, would at this time gain a close friendship with his uncle Joe Cozzo, and the two would keep the family business running. Soon, as Giacomo Ancelotti and his uncle Joe Cozzo began to deal with Gaetano the Man Violante, who would abuse them and treat them with disrespect, they would develop a deep disdain for Violante, and unbeknownst to Violante, Giacomo Ancelotti would commonly urinate in the wine bottles they would hand over as tribute to Violante. In March of 1914, Giacomo Ancelotti would marry his first cousin, 17-year-old Maria Cozzo, the daughter of his uncle Joe Cozzo. Not long after, in May of 1915, the two would have their first son, Anthony Ancelotti. It was around this time in 1915 when the now 19-year-old Giacomo Ancelotti, who had spent his formative years in Lower Algonquin during the rise of the American Mafia, would become involved in the world of crime and would now insist that friends call him Jack instead of Giacomo. Jack Ancelotti, who was known to hang on street corners with the other young Italian kids around the neighborhood, had befriended a local thief from Columbus Avenue, John Stiglione. or as he was known on the streets, Johnny Stugotz. Soon, Jack Ancelotti, alongside Johnny Stugotz, who were born in the same year of 1896, would begin pulling off low-level robbery and extortion operations around Algonquin. Additionally, by 1916, Ancelotti and Stiglione would begin extorting the Chinese immigrants from Diamond Street, shaking down gambling dens, restaurants, and other businesses. Around the year 1916, when Jack Ancelotti's Uncle Joe Cozzo would catch wind of his nephew's activity, Cozzo, Ancelotti, and Johnny Stugotz would begin orchestrating large-scale robberies at the docks in the Algonquin fish market, an area that Cozzo knew better than anyone. Soon, with their control over Cozzo imports and the ability to rip off cargo ships at the fish market, Jack Ancelotti and his Uncle Joe were starting to rise as prominent figures in Algonquin. In December of 1915, when Gioacchino Ancelotti's wife, Allegra Ancelotti, would discover that her husband Gioacchino was having an affair with a school teacher, Allegra Ancelotti would shoot and kill her husband Gioacchino inside of their Columbus Avenue apartment. Following the death of Gioacchino Ancelotti, Gioacchino's son, the now 19-year-old Jack Ancelotti would support both his mother and siblings, as well as his wife Maria and son Anthony, and by this point, Jack was gaining power in Lower Easton. In June of 1915, when Jack Ancelotti's wife Maria was shopping near a Columbus Avenue market, two neighborhood kids would rob Maria Ancelotti, punching her in the face and taking her groceries and purse. Following this, just days later when Jack Ancelotti would spot one of the hoods, Ancelotti would brutally beat the young man to death in broad daylight on the crowded corner of Emerald Street and Bismarck Avenue. The following week, Jack Ancelotti and Johnny Stugotz would kidnap the other hoodlum from his Lower Easton apartment late in the night, and Ancelotti and Stugotz would subsequently hang the robber on a noose from a streetlight on Columbus Avenue, sending a clear message throughout the neighborhood. It was around this time, in the summer of 1915, as Jack Ancelotti was becoming feared in Algonquin, Gaetano the Man Violante and the Columbus Avenue gang would begin to recruit Ancelotti. Soon, Jack Ancelotti, alongside his right-hand man Johnny Stugotz, would begin to make collections and carry out beatings for Violante and his gang. Ancelotti and Stugotz, two violent young thugs raised in the streets of Algonquin, would take well to this kind of work, and the two would soon become notorious in the area. By 1916, Jack Ancelotti, alongside his Uncle Joe Cozzo, would begin organizing a highly lucrative gambling ring in both the Lower Easton area, as well as the uptown Algonquin neighborhood of East Holland, an area that was at the time developing a large Italian population. Soon, Ancelotti and Cozzo would control the gambling scene in East Holland and operate a major gambling network in Lower Easton with Gaetano the Man Violante. Ancelotti and Cozzo during this time would continue to operate their import company out of the Algonquin fish market, which they would use to aid their criminal activities. In 1917, the now 34-year-old Joe Cozzo, who was known on the streets as Uncle Joe, would move with his wife into a spacious brownstone in the East Holland neighborhood, an area that Cozzo had close control over. However, Cozzo would maintain highly profitable rackets down on Columbus and Emerald. Also around this time, in November of 1917, the now 21-year-old Jack Ancelotti would move with his wife and young son into a 3-story compound on Emerald Street and Bismarck Avenue, in the heart of Lower Easton. Soon, in December of 1917, Ancelotti would open a social club on the building's first floor, known as the Santa Maria Club, and this club would serve as the headquarters for Ancelotti's growing crew. In 1918, Johnny Stugotz would begin having an affair with a woman named Angelina Santorelli, the wife of high-ranking Columbus Avenue gang member, Big Lenny Santorelli. Santorelli, who was a close confidant of Gaetano the Man Violante, would soon begin to make a beef with Johnny Stugotz. In February of 1918, when Big Lenny Santorelli would find Johnny Stugotz and Jack Ancelotti at the Algonquin fish market, Santorelli would approach Stugotz, raising his voice and threatening to have him killed. Subsequently, Jack Ancelotti and Johnny Stugotz would beat Santorelli before tossing him in the freezing cold Humboldt River, killing him. Soon, when Violante would discover that Santorelli, one of his top earners, had been murdered at the fish market, Violante would hold Jack Ancelotti responsible, and would become furious. In March of 1918, Gaetano the Man Violante would send enforcers to the Santa Maria Club late at night, and the enforcers would subsequently storm the social club, hold its patrons at gunpoint, and kidnap Jack Ancelotti. Following this, Violante's enforcers would bring Ancelotti to a warehouse in Boabo Broker, owned by Violante. When Violante arrived at the warehouse in Boabo, he would walk into a rope-bound Jack Ancelotti being beaten with a plumber's wrench and burned with a blowtorch. As Violante would approach the expressionless Jack Ancelotti, Violante would attempt to interrogate Ancelotti. As it became clear that Ancelotti wouldn't tell about the death of Lenny Santorelli, Violante would order his men to carry Ancelotti out to the docks to be buried at sea. Then, as Violante and his enforcers would drag Jack Ancelotti out onto the broker docks, they would be met with an ambush from Uncle Joe Cozzo and Johnny Stugatz, who would open fire with Tommy guns at Violante and his enforcers. As this happened, a major gun battle would ensue. And while Uncle Joe and Johnny Stugatz would outgun the Violante enforcers, Violante would manage to escape. Following the shootout at the broker docks, a war was now being waged in Lower Easton, between the Gaetano Violante-led Columbus Avenue gang and a new opposing faction led by Jack Ancelotti and Joe Cozzo. From March of 1918 to May of 1918, more than 100 shootouts would be attributed to this war in and around Lower Easton. In June of 1918, Jack Ancelotti's older brother, 31-year-old Aldolfo "Al the Fisherman" Ancelotti, who was considered the most skilled fisherman in Liberty City, would be gunned down on the corner of Emerald Street and Albany Avenue while exiting a neighborhood bar. The following week, after Gaetano Violante's sister would be shot and killed on Columbus Avenue by the orders of Jack Ancelotti, Violante, who had been in hiding for several months, would return to his homeland of Naples, Italy, abandoning the war in Lower Easton. While Violante, who was being hunted around Liberty City, would save himself by fleeing back to Italy, it would prove to be a strategic mistake in maintaining his interests on the street. By January of 1919, with Violante out of the country, the Ancelotti gang had killed all of Violante's key successors and taken over his Lower Easton territory. By this point, Cozzo Imports was now being used as a front for Ancelotti and Cozzo to wash their illegal money, as well as legitimately serving as a major wine distributor around the city. It was around this time Jack Ancelotti would essentially take over the entire Algonquin fish market, strong-arming authorities, controlling the ports, and shaking down the many companies and unions operating out of the area. Soon, with the now 23-year-old Jack Ancelotti's control of the Algonquin fish market, his successful wine distribution company, and his stronghold over organized crime rackets in areas like Lower Easton and East Holland, the young Jack Ancelotti would become one of the wealthiest gangsters in Algonquin. At this point in the year 1919, Liberty City, more than ever before, was a town rife with gangsters and organized crime, with notorious mob leaders like Pete the Boss Marcello, Wild Johnny Pavano, Dario Terranova, Carlo Gambetti, Connor the Fox O'Brien, Joe the Bat Chironi, Jack the Devastator Burke and Carmen Lupacella, all struggling to control underworld rackets. Gangland killings were an everyday fact of life, and Liberty City was quickly building a reputation as a crime-filled dump. During this time, Jack Ancelotti would become allied with Dukes-based mob leaders, Joe the Bat Chironi, and Mike Scars Solizzo, who led a powerful gang in Cerveza Heights, Dukes, and these groups would smuggle large amounts of illegal contraband into the streets of Liberty City through Ancelotti's connections at the Humboldt River. In June of 1919, Jack Ancelotti, who had close familial ties to organized crime groups in Napoli, would arrange for the murder of Gaetano the Man Violante, as Violante, who was laying low on the outskirts of Napoli, would be blown to pieces in a car bombing. The following month, when Lower Easton-based Ancelotti soldier, Tony the Bean Shooter Esposito, was said to be cooperating with Liberty City police investigators, Esposito would be found shot dead in his apartment with a canary shoved in his mouth. The hit was said to be carried out by Ancelotti himself. By this time, Ancelotti, who ruled the east side of Algonquin with impunity, was known to be immensely feared on the streets of Liberty City, as stories would pass of his many violent acts. By the early months of 1920, as a law passed around the United States prohibiting the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages, the Ancelotti gang and the Liberty City streets would be changed forever, as the Prohibition era would begin. Initially, in the early months of 1920, Jack Ancelotti and Joe Cazzo, through their connections in the liquor distribution industry, would begin ordering massive amounts of illegal liquor to be shipped into the Algonquin fish market. For the Ancelottis, this key connection would prove to be crucial for their early control over the bootlegging trade in Liberty City. By the end of 1920, with Dukes-based mob leader Joe the Bat Chironi's connections to Italian bootleggers in Canada, the Ancelotti syndicate was flooding the streets of Liberty City with liquor, importing boatloads of crates containing high-quality liquors from around the world. Soon, the Ancelotti syndicate would supply many smaller gangs around the city with liquor and begin to operate many popular speakeasies along Columbus Avenue, while the West Side during this time would fall under the rule of powerful Sicilian mob bosses, Pete the Boss Marcello, and Wild Johnny Pavano. The East Side during this time was known as the territory of Jack Ancelotti and his violent gang, who made it impossible for other gangs to rise in the area. By 1921, Jack Ancelotti and his gang would be some of the main suppliers of liquor on the streets of Algonquin, as they were well connected and highly respected around the borough. Soon, Ancelotti would develop dealings with a successful black bootlegger from uptown Algonquin, Leroy Moneybag Johnson. Johnson, who led a black bootlegging gang on Zenatime Street, was known to purchase large amounts of liquor from the Ancelottis, in addition to paying the Ancelottis to protect them from the other Italian gangs. Ancelotti, who would take a liking to Moneybag Johnson, would help Johnson and his gang on Zenatime Street to make millions in bootlegging, and Johnson would be known as an ally to the Ancelotti gang. Additionally, Ancelotti was known to have dealings with the Chinese immigrants who at the time congregated in the area of Diamond Street in the Lower East Side. The Chinese, who had long been gambling with Ancelotti and his gang, would at this time begin operating their own speakeasies around the Lower East Side, and would make key clientele for the Ancelotti gang. By this point in the year 1922, Jack Ancelotti had established powerful crews around Liberty City. In Lower Easton, Jack Ancelotti had street crews operated by high-ranking Ancelotti gangsters, 26-year-old Johnny Stugat Stiglione, 32-year-old Tommy Guns Giannetti, and 27-year-old Joe the Killer Saladino. In East Holland, Ancelotti had powerful street crews led by 39-year-old Joseph Uncle Joe Cazzo, as well as 25-year-old Salvatore Sally Boxcars Diarco, who also held territory in South Slopes Broker. These street crews, all of whom loyally kicked up to Jack Ancelotti, were all highly active in bootlegging, gambling, extortion, prostitution, fencing, narcotics trafficking, and various other criminal operations.
Also around this time in 1922, Jack Ancelotti's 19-year-old nephew, Carlo Ancelotti, would begin to make a name for himself in the Lower Easton streets. Carlo Ancelotti, whose father Adolfo Al the Fisherman Ancelotti was murdered back in 1918, was known to be close with his uncle Jack, who would show young Carlo the ways of the streets. By age 19, Carlo Ancelotti was leading a young crew of Italian gangsters in the Lower Easton neighborhood, known to shake down businesses, run numbers, rob boxcars, and occasionally carry out small jobs for his Uncle Jack's gang. By 1923, Jack Ancelotti and his gang had developed close connections with the LCPD in both the Lower Easton precinct as well as the East Holland precinct. The Ancelottis, many of whom were millionaires by this point, would be able to bribe many corrupt police officers in these areas, allowing themselves to operate in their territories completely unbothered. Eventually, Ancelotti would begin bribing powerful city hall officials, many of whom were just as big of drunks as the common Liberty City street dwellers. By 1924, as several Italian mafia groups were now thriving around Lower Algonquin, the Ancelottis would maintain their presence in the streets. By this point, the Ancelottis had reached an agreement with the Pavano Syndicate, a highly powerful gang based in the West Side, to respect each other's territories. Additionally, Jack Ancelotti had a mutual respect with neighboring gang leaders Dario Terranova and Carlo Gambetti, who operated along Denver Avenue. In June of 1924, one of Jack Ancelotti's powerful Lower Easton capos, 29-year-old Joe the Killer Saladino, alongside one of his respected soldiers, 35-year-old Joey Bifocals de Simone, would develop a rivalry with a Jewish bootlegger based out of Castle Gardens, 56-year-old Julius Jerry the Jew Rothstein. Jerry the Jew, who was a prominent racketeer in and around Lower Algonquin, had reportedly stopped doing business with Joe the Killer Saladino's crew, and instead established ties with Jewish gangs in Bohan. In response, in June of 1924, Joe the Killer Saladino and Joey Bifocals DeSimone would rig Jerry the Jew Rothstein's Dundreary sedan with a car bomb outside of his home in Castle Gardens. The following morning, as Rothstein would start his Dundreary, the sedan would burst into flames and Rothstein would be blown to pieces. Following this, just days later, a major shootout would take place outside of a social club on the corner of Luddite Row and Feldspar Street between the Saladino crew and Jewish gangsters tied to Jerry the Jew Rothstein. In this shootout, nearly a dozen Ancelotti associates would be slain, including 35-year-old Joey Bifocals DeSimone, who was shot multiple times. The following week, another shootout would take place at the Castle Gardens Hotel, where more than 20 Jewish gangsters would be slain. Soon after, Jack Ancelotti and his crews would take control of the operations formerly ran by Jerry the Jew, and the Jewish mob in Castle Gardens would be wiped out. In the early months of 1925, a small coalition of mostly Irish police officers from the LCPD's Lower Easton Precinct wanted to challenge the system and crack down on the bootleggers that were operating in Lower Easton with impunity. Soon, certain LCPD officers would begin to harass Ancelotti gangsters in and around the Lower Easton neighborhood. In March of 1925, when 3 police officers would raid a speakeasy operated by Ancelotti capo Tommy Guns Gianetti on Garnet Street, a shootout would take place, and all 3 of the officers would be slain and later buried at sea. While many officers within the LCPD would be outraged following this incident, soon Jack Ancelotti, through his connections to corrupt city officials, would arrange for these murders to be covered up. By this point in the mid-1920s, Jack Ancelotti had become notorious throughout the entire city as a violent mob boss, not to be crossed. During these years, as the many gangs of Lower Algonquin would go to war in the streets, the Ancelottis would create massive earnings, while maintaining peace in their territories. Additionally, Jack Ancelotti had friendships with other powerful Italian mafia figures in Algonquin, particularly within the Pavano syndicate of the West Side. However, in the late months of 1927, the Ancelottis would begin to develop rivalries. During this time, as the bootlegging trade in Liberty City was becoming increasingly overcrowded with various criminal entities, powerful Ancelotti capo, 32-year-old Joe the Killer Saladino, would attempt to take out the competition. In December of 1927, Saladino would order his soldiers to beat and shake down various known Black, Chinese, and Irish bootleggers in Lower Algonquin. Soon, as several attacks would be carried out around Lower Algonquin, a new order would be established in the area. Saladino, who was feared throughout the borough, would soon begin collecting street tax on various bootlegging outfits around Lower Algonquin, while operating his own massive bootlegging operation out of the Algonquin fish market. While Joe the Killer Saladino and his crew would be successful in these shakedowns, it would later be revealed that many of the bootleggers the Saladino crew had shaken down were connected to a powerful Italian mobster, Tommaso "Tommy Bottles" D'Angelo. D'Angelo, who operated a tough street crew on the corner of Denver Avenue and Feldspar Street, was a member of the powerful Gambetti syndicate, led by 36-year-old Carlo Gambetti. Soon, as many of the low-level bootleggers would complain to Tommy Bottles about the Ancelotti's extortion, Tommy Bottles would plan to make a statement. In February of 1928, Tommy Bottles D'Angelo would send enforcers to a gambling den in Lower Easton on the corner of Garnet Street and Albany Avenue, operated by Joe the Killer Saladino's crew. As the D'Angelo enforcers arrived, several Saladino associates would be beaten by the enforcers. Soon after this, as Saladino and the rest of the Ancelottis would find out what had happened, Saladino would send enforcers to a Gambetti-operated gambling den on Denver Avenue and Feldspar Street, where they would beat several associates connected to Tommy Bottles, robbing them for $2,000 in the process. As this happened, a new war would be waged between the Ancelotti syndicate and the Gambetti syndicate. In April of 1928, as the Ancelottis were overseeing a massive liquor shipment at the Algonquin fish market, they would be ambushed by Gambetti enforcers, and a massive gun battle would ensue. In this shootout, more than 40 men would be killed. The following month, another massive shootout would take place between the Ancelottis and Gambettis on the corner of Garnet Street and Denver Avenue. By January of 1929, Jack Ancelotti would arrange to meet with feared Gambetti syndicate leader Carlo Gambetti. Soon, Ancelotti, who would fearlessly walk into Gambetti territory in order to meet Carlo Gambetti, would demand a ceasefire between their gangs and would tell Gambetti, quote, Either there will be peace on my streets, or there will be your brains on my streets. While this was a jarring message, Gambetti, who, like Ancelotti, came from Napoli, would form a respect for Ancelotti, and soon Gambetti would order his men to hold back from conflict with the Ancelotti syndicate, ending the war. By 1930, an internal conflict was forming in East Holland between 32-year-old Salvatore Sally Boxcars Diarco, who led a large group of violent Ancelotti gangsters on Vauxhall Street, and 46-year-old Joe Cazzo, who served as Jack Ancelotti's personal advisor, as well as operating a powerful crew on Uranium Street and Exeter Avenue. Sally Boxcars, who was originally from the South Slopes neighborhood in Broker and moved to East Holland in 1914, became a member of the Ancelotti gang in the year 1916, beginning as a debt collector for Uncle Joe Cazzo. During this period, Sally Boxcars had built a feared street crew operating in both East Holland and South Slopes, and had maintained a close relationship with Cazzo, who treated him as a protege. However, during the Prohibition years, as Sally Boxcars became a major player on Vauxhall Street, a divide had grown between Cazzo and Diarco. As this was happening, in the early months of 1930, the prohibition of alcohol would be lifted federally, depriving the Ancelotti gang of their primary source of cash flow. Anxious about the future of the organization, Uncle Joe Cazzo would soon devise a plan to maintain his wealth in the streets. In March of 1930, Cazzo would send for Sally Boxcars Diarco to sit down with him in a crowded restaurant on Exeter Avenue. At this sit-down, which was held in a corner booth surrounded by guards, Cazzo would question Diarco about his operations and display his lack of trust to his former protege. Following the meeting, as Diarco went to leave, Cazzo would approach Diarco, kissing him on the cheek and what was known as the kiss of death. Later that night, as Sally Boxcars Diarco climbed his Vauxhall Street stoop, Diarco would be hailed with gunfire and killed at the age of 32. Following the death of Diarco, Uncle Joe Cazzo would break up the remaining Diarco crew, taking over his operations along Vauxhall Street in East Holland, as well as taking control of the Ancelotti's broker presence. Soon, Uncle Joe Cazzo would be running a lucrative loan sharking and gambling crew around Broker, as well as opening a street crew in the Meadow Hills neighborhood in Dukes. In May of 1930, one of Jack Ancelotti's friends, Pavano's syndicate leader Marco the Typewriter Centrella, who is in the midst of a tense war with the Gambettis, would survive a botched shooting on Castle Drive West. Following this, Marco the Typewriter Centrella would arrange for a sit-down in Broker with Carlo Gambetti. Following this sit-down, Centrella and Gambetti, both of whom were friends of Jack Ancelotti, would begin to organize the 5 mafia families of Liberty City in an attempt to establish order in the streets. Soon, Marco Centrella of Frankfurt Avenue, Carlo Gambetti of Denver Avenue, Jack Ancelotti of Columbus Avenue, Mario Messina of Dukes, and Carmine Lupacella of Bohan, the heads of each of the city's 5 families, would officially form the Commission, a ruling panel for these gangs to operate under. By this point, the 5 families were each highly structured, with positions, rules, and procedures to run what they referred to as Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing. The families each had bosses, underbosses, consiglières to advise the families, captains to run street crews, and soldiers to crack heads in the streets. With the abolition of the Prohibition law, these 5 mafia groups would develop new lucrative rackets to keep their empires afloat. This would include more white-collar activity like union extortion, construction, and waste management, as well as more traditional rackets like gambling, prostitution, peep shows, and loan sharking. By 1930, the Ancelotti family had a stronghold over construction contracts around the east side of Algonquin, as well as the many unions that operated out of the Algonquin fish market, making them extremely wealthy even without the bootlegging trade. Additionally, it was around this time that Uncle Joe Cazzo and his crew would become involved in the heroin business, moving large quantities of heroin around East Holland and Lower Easton, as well as other areas. Soon, Uncle Joe Cazzo and his crew in East Holland would become Liberty City's main suppliers of heroin. By 1931, Jack Ancelotti's 28-year-old nephew, Carlo Ancelotti, who ran a highly profitable loan sharking and gambling operation on Luddite Row and Feldspar Street, would be inducted as a made member of the Ancelotti crime family. By this point, Carlo Ancelotti, who was now one of the family's top earners, would be nicknamed Carlo the Rope, as he had been known to use ropes to strangle and kill many of his adversaries. However, by 1932, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would be sentenced to 10 years on extortion and terrorism charges for setting fire to a restaurant on the corner of Columbus Avenue and Obsidian Street. In 1932, Jack Ancelotti, alongside a powerful Gambetti soldier from Denver Avenue, 40-year-old Tony the Lampshade LaRusso, would oversee the construction of a massive skyscraper construction project in the Exchange section of downtown Algonquin on the corner of Albany Avenue and Barium Street. This project, known as the Albany and Barium Building, would allow Ancelotti and LaRusso to collect millions from city funds. However, Jack Ancelotti would soon realize he could earn himself even more money if he attempted to control the project himself. In August of 1932, Jack Ancelotti would push Gambetti soldier Tony the Lampshade LaRusso from the roof of the building, where LaRusso would plummet more than 150 stories before landing on Albany Avenue. Following the death of Tony the Lampshade, Ancelotti would take over the project, and the death would be perceived by the Gambettis as an accident, as Tony Lampshade was known to be a drunk. In 1933, a rift would form between the now 37-year-old Jack Ancelotti and his underboss, Johnny Stugat Stiglione. This began in the early months of 1933, when Stiglione began secretly seeing a Middle Park East woman named Louise Skunt, who was known as Jack Ancelotti's mistress. Soon, when a drunken Louise Skunt would reveal this to Jack Ancelotti, Ancelotti would become enraged and begin to plot his retaliation. In February of 1933, Johnny Stugotz would be lured late in the night to a restaurant in Meadow Hills Dukes to meet with Uncle Joe Cazzo. However, when Johnny Stugotz arrived, he would enter a dark, empty restaurant. Not long after, Jack Ancelotti would appear from behind the bar of the restaurant, firing 3 shots at Johnny Stugotz with a .32 revolver, killing him at the age of 37. With the death of Johnny Stugotz, Jack Ancelotti would appoint his younger brother, 34-year-old Pietro P.D. Bullets Ancelotti, as the family's new underboss. By the year 1935, a large housing project was constructed just north of Lower Easton, in the President's City neighborhood. As this was happening, black residents began flooding the area of President's City, which would eventually spill over into the Lower Easton neighborhood. Soon, the Ancelottis would begin running several gambling operations through the neighboring black community, as well as flooding their streets with heroin. Also in the year 1935, Jack Ancelotti's firstborn son, Anthony Ancelotti, would begin working for the Ancelotti crime family on Emerald Street, running gambling sheets and carrying out acts of violence for his father's friends. Anthony Ancelotti, who was known to be as tough as he was stupid, led a group of feared young Ancelotti associates in Lower Easton, viewed as the next generation of the family. In the year 1936, Jack Ancelotti, alongside powerful Pavano family boss, Marco the typewriter Centrella, would send representatives out to a newly developing city on the west coast, Las Venturas. This city, which was built in the center of the desert, had recently legalized casino gambling, and soon many powerful crime bosses from around the country would develop numerous rackets based in this rapidly growing city. The following year, when Marco the typewriter began pressuring Alderney state lobbyists, a law would be passed in June of 1937, legalizing casino gambling in the state of Alderney. Soon after, Marco Centrella and Jack Ancelotti would begin to fund the construction of a luxurious casino in Westdyke, Alderney, modeled after the Venturas casinos they had operated in the prior year. By the early months of 1938, the Alderney Casino would open its doors and would soon become a popular destination for high rollers from all around the Liberty City metropolitan area. The casino, which was secretly under the ownership of Jack Ancelotti and Marco Centrella, would soon generate millions for both the Ancelotti and Pavano crime families. In 1939, the Messina crime family boss, Mario Messina, would attempt to invest in the casino, and while Messina would attend several sit-downs in regards to the casino, Jack Ancelotti would eventually refuse to let Messina into the casino, telling Messina to go build his own casino in Dukes. In February of 1940, Jack Ancelotti and Marco Centrella would reach an agreement with Alderney family boss, 36-year-old Carmine Pegorino, who would be given 20% of the Alderney casino in exchange for Alderney labor union interest for the Ancelotti and Pavano families. The following month, in March of 1940, the now 37-year-old Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would be released from Liberty State Correctional Facility after serving 8 years. Upon the release of Carlo the Rope would regain his position as captain over a large crew in Lower Easton, and by this point Carlo the Rope had become one of the family's most powerful figures, viewed as a possible successor to Jack Ancelotti. Over the years, many of Uncle Joe Cazzo's soldiers in East Holland had become heroin kingpins, and by this point, East Holland had developed a reputation as the city's heroin hotspot. East Holland, which by the 1940s had become a melting pot of Black, Spanish, and Italian residents, was home to many of Liberty City's top drug dealers, and all of these dealers would be selling drugs ran by the Ancelotti family. Eventually, the Ancelottis in East Holland would expand their heroin operation into Bohan, a borough that had always been under the strict rule of Carmine Lupicella and his family. By 1941, East Holland heroin kingpin, Giovanni "Johnny the Bug" Lombardo, would develop ties with an up-and-coming black drug dealer from South Bohan, 39-year-old Howard "Howley" Robinson. Howley Robinson, who led a massive black street gang based in the South Bohan housing projects, was by this time purchasing large quantities of heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and various other drugs from Johnny the Bug Lombardo, and soon Lombardo would begin to flood the streets of South Bohan with drugs through the black street gangs. While Howley Robinson was known to pay street tax to the feared Carmine Lupicella, who ran South Bohan with an iron fist, it was unbeknownst to Lupicella that Howley Robinson's suppliers were with the Ancelottis. Soon, Johnny the Bug Lombardo and the East Holland Ancelottis would begin to heavily extort Howley Robinson and his gang, shaking them down with their own street tax, and eventually Howley Robinson would find himself in extreme debt with both the Lupicellas and the Ancelotti family. In January of 1942, Howley Robinson would meet with Jack Ancelotti and Joe Cazzo at a social club in East Holland, pleading with the Ancelotti bosses to help make his debts with the Lupicellas disappear. Howley Robinson, who by this point had built his own successful black drug distribution ring around South Bohan, had been a lucrative earner for the Ancelottis, and soon Jack Ancelotti would look to assert control over the black drug trade in South Bohan. Soon after, in January of 1942, Jack Ancelotti would visit Carmine Lupicella at his social club on Joliet Street. At the Lupicella Club, Jack Ancelotti made it clear that Howley Robinson was with the Ancelottis, telling Lupicella to back off. Upon hearing this, Carmine Lupicella, who was a feared mob boss known for his cold demeanor and ruthless tendencies, would become livid, telling Ancelotti to leave, and telling him not to come back to South Bohan. Following this, Ancelotti would leave, but not before telling Lupicella, quote, "Fuck South Bohan." Just days later, in a message to the Ancelottis, Carmine Lupicella would order the execution of Howley Robinson, as Robinson would be shot 12 times on San Quentin Avenue in South Bohan. In the following weeks, Carmine Lupicella would learn that members of the Ancelottis in East Holland had been supplying the Howley Robinson gang all along, and flooding his South Bohan streets with drugs. Additionally, it would be revealed that the Ancelottis were also carrying out robberies and hijackings, as well as controlling several bookmakers around South Bohan, without the Lupicella's consent. In August of 1942, Carmine Lupicella would meet with representatives from the Gambetti, Pavano, and Messina crime families to discuss his feud with the Ancelottis. In this meeting, Carmine Lupicella would call for the death of Jack Ancelotti for his subversive behavior, and while many in the commission had grown weary of Jack Ancelotti, who was known in mafia circles as Mad Jack, the commission would ultimately rule against the execution of Ancelotti. Soon after, message would be sent to Jack Ancelotti that the commission had spared his life, and that his family had to respect the Lupicella's territory and no longer operate in secrecy from the other families. Following this, Jack Ancelotti and Carmine Lupicella would maintain a mutual hatred for each other, and tension would continue to grow. In the early months of 1943, the Ancelotti-Lupicella conflict would rekindle when members of the Ancelottis in East Holland would plan the burglary of a Lupicella social club in Dukes. The social club in Dukes, which was operated by powerful Lupicella capo, Santo Capuano, was rumored to hold large sums of cash, firearms, and other valuables, which the Ancelotti robbers would plan to steal from the Lupicellas overnight. Jack Ancelotti, upon hearing this plan, fully encouraged it, as Ancelotti now despised the Lupicella family. In March of 1943, several Ancelotti associates would break into Santo Capuano's social club late in the night, coming away with $700,000 in cash, several shotguns and rifles, and several sticks of dynamite. Additionally, the robbers would rip off several taxidermy heads the Lupacella gangsters had collected on hunting trips, as well as a signed poster of Liberty City swingers legend Tony D'Amato. Following this robbery, shockwaves would immediately be sent through the Liberty City underworld. The Lupacellas, who were a ruthless crime family, were now out for blood and looking to make a statement. While it was initially unclear who could have carried out this robbery, rumors would soon begin to circulate that the Ancelotti family was involved. Then, the following month, in April of 1943, a powerful Messina capo from broker, Luigi Louis Wheels Finelli, would sit down with Ancelotti members at a social club on Vauxhall Street in East Holland. During this sit-down, as Louis Wheels Finelli would discuss business with the Ancelottis, Finelli would observe a taxidermy head on the wall that closely resembled one he had seen at Santo Capuano's social club in Dukes. Louis Wheels, who was known to have close relationships with the Lupacellas on Harrison Street, had heard about the recent robbery, and immediately, Finelli would begin to suspect the Ancelottis. The following day, Louis Wheels Finelli would call for a sit-down with Santo Capuano, where Finelli would relay this observation to the Lupacellas. Soon, as this information would reach the ears of Carmine Lupacella, Lupacella would become enraged and decide to make an example out of his rival, Jack Ancelotti. In June of 1943, as Giacomo Jack Ancelotti would purchase fruit from a street vendor on the corner of Emerald Street and Bismarck Avenue, just across the street from his home, Lupacella hitmen would approach in a black Albany sedan, hailing Ancelotti with gunfire, killing Ancelotti at the age of 47. In the days following the death of Jack Ancelotti, a funeral service would be held at the Columbus Cathedral and Hatton Gardens. In attendance at this funeral were mob figures, union figures, politicians, businessmen, police officials, and several of Jack Ancelotti's relatives who would visit from Napoli. Back in Lower Easton, it would be decided within the family that Jack Ancelotti's 40-year-old nephew, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, would be appointed as the family's new Don. Soon after, Carlo the Rope would appoint his right-hand man, 43-year-old Big Donnie DiGeronimo, as the family's underboss, and the late Jack Ancelotti's younger brother, 44-year-old Peter Bullets Ancelotti, would be named the family's consigliere. Not long after this, as the word would hit the streets that it was the Lupacellas who had taken out Jack Ancelotti, the Ancelotti family would begin to plot their revenge, but not before going through internal conflict. In July of 1943, the now 60-year-old Uncle Joe Cazzo, who had been demoted from the consigliere of the family down to a capo position, would begin to develop a rivalry with Carlo the Rope and the new administration of the family. Uncle Joe, who was highly influential in East Holland, had many loyalists, and many felt Uncle Joe should have been named boss instead of Carlo. Soon as the Ancelotti family's new Don, Carlo the Rope, would begin to feel threatened by Uncle Joe, Ancelotti would begin to plot his demise. In September of 1943, as 60-year-old Uncle Joe Cazzo would exit a Star Junction jazz club onto the corner Frankfurt Avenue and Manganese Street late in the night, Cazzo, alongside his mistress, 27-year-old Marilyn Munchwell, would be hailed with gunfire on the orders of Carlo the Rope, and Cazzo would later be pronounced dead at the scene. Following the death of Uncle Joe Cazzo, a reorganization would take place in the East Holland Ancelottis, as Carlo the Rope would appoint two new capos, 43-year-old Nicky Slick Lombardo and 56-year-old Big Joe Cornudo, to run the East Holland neighborhood. Additionally, Carlo the Rope would appoint a rising star in the family out of South Slopes broker, 32-year-old Francesco Greaseball Frank Amato, to run the family's presence around Broker and Dukes. Greaseball Frank, who immigrated to Broker from Sicily in 1929, had by 1943 become a major earner for the Ancelottis and a highly respected and feared gangster around Broker. In the Lower Easton neighborhood, the Ancelotti family had three highly active street crews. The Saladino crew, ran by 48-year-old Joe the Killer Saladino; the Gianetti crew, ran by 53-year-old Tommy Guns Gianetti; and the Anthony Ancelotti crew, ran by 28-year-old Anthony Ancelotti. Soon, as Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would establish himself within the commission, Ancelotti would begin pushing to have Carmine Lupacella killed for the Jack Ancelotti hit. However, by the end of the summer of 1943, it became clear that the commission would not sanction the murder of Carmine Lupacella and would instead urge for the Ancelottis and Lupacellas to make a peace deal. Soon, despite the commission's stance on the matter, Carlo the Rope would be pressured from within his family to act on his own and strike back against the Lupacellas without a commission blessing. Then, in December of 1943, just days before Christmas, as the 55-year-old Don of the Lupacella crime family, Carmine Lupacella dined in a restaurant on Exeter Avenue in East Holland. Lupacella, alongside his 55-year-old underboss, Lorenzo Ditto, would be shot multiple times by Ancelotti hitmen. While Lorenzo Ditto, who was shot 7 times in the face and body, would be pronounced dead at the scene, Carmine Lupacella, who was shot 5 times in the abdomen, would survive after being transferred to the Holland Hospital Center on Frankfurt Avenue. Following the botched shooting of Carmine Lupacella, Carlo the Rope would be livid, and it was said that Ancelotti would order all of the hitmen involved in the shooting to be killed soon after. Carmine Lupacella, following this shooting, would be hospitalized for roughly a month at the Bohan Medical and Dental Center in Northern Gardens, and upon his release, would be bedridden for several months with pneumonia. Following these events, Carmine Lupacella would be temporarily succeeded by his younger brother, Calogero the Nose Lupacella, and the Nose would soon begin to plot his retaliation against the Ancelotti crime family. Carlo the Rope during this time would lay low, living on the lam with his family in the Caraways, and through his relationship with influential Pavano family Don, Marco the typewriter Centrella, Ancelotti would be able to avoid consequences from the commission. However, throughout the year 1944, the Lupacellas would carry out multiple shootings around Algonquin, and more than a dozen Ancelotti soldiers would be killed in the street. During this time, the Ancelottis would too engage in the bloodshed, taking out several Lupacella soldiers throughout the year 1944. By 1945, after the Lupacella-Ancelotti War had made headlines in the media and attracted unwanted attention onto the mafia, the commission would step in to resolve the conflict. In May of 1945, Pavano family Don Marco the typewriter Centrella would arrange for a sit-down between Carlo the Rope Ancelotti and Calogero the Nose Lupacella, where Centrella would force Ancelotti and Lupacella to come to a peace agreement. Soon, after a ceasefire agreement was finally made, the war would be ended, and peace would be restored within the 5 families. However, an animosity would fester between the Ancelotti and Lupacella families for generations to come. In July of 1945, a distant cousin of Carlo the Rope, 42-year-old Enrico Ancelotti, would immigrate from Naples, Italy, to the quiet North American country of Canada. Enrico Ancelotti, who was a former mafia soldier in Napoli, would soon begin to organize a criminal enterprise around Canada, involved in gambling, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, hijacking, prostitution, and various other forms of criminal activity. Enrico Ancelotti, who had developed a close relationship with the American Ancelotti family during Jack Ancelotti's funeral in 1943, would soon begin to work closely with Carlo the Rope, and not long after, the Enrico Ancelotti family in Canada would become a crew within Carlo the Rope's Ancelotti crime family. By 1946, the now 56-year-old Tommy Guns Giannetti, who had for many years overseen the Ancelotti family's interest in the Alderney Casino, would begin to spread his crew into the streets of Alderney City, developing several gambling and loan sharking operations in the area. By the end of 1946, Tommy Guns and his crew were taking over territory in Alderney City and heavily extorting the Alderney crime family, led by 42-year-old Carmine Pegorino. Also in 1946, the now 51-year-old Joe the Killer Saladino would be taken down by the FIB on charges of gambling, loan sharking, and tax evasion, and sentenced to 10 years in upstate Liberty. With powerful capo Joe the Killer Saladino off the street, Saladino's right-hand man, 53-year-old Vito De Simone, would step in as acting capo, taking over Saladino's crew. In 1947, Carlo the Rope would send his cousin, 32-year-old Anthony Ancelotti, as well as Ancelotti underboss, 47-year-old Big Donnie DiGeronimo, down to the state of Leonida to spread their influence. Soon, Big Donnie DiGeronimo and Anthony Ancelotti would meet with several powerful crime figures in Leonida, including the representatives from the Leonida crime family, and subsequently, the Ancelotti family would plan an expansion into Leonida. By 1948, Anthony Ancelotti and his crew from Lower Easton would develop a stronghold of criminal rackets in Leonida, particularly in the vibrant and bustling Vice City. It was around this time Anthony Ancelotti, along with 2 of his top soldiers, 32-year-old Slow Tony Giannetti and 35-year-old Jimmy Redwoods Giordano, would move down to Leonida full-time, trading the grime and grit of Algonquin for the plush and luxurious life of Vice City. By 1949, with the Ancelottis now operating in Liberty City, Alderney City, Canada, Las Venturas, and Vice City. They had become as powerful as ever, with influence spanning from North America to Europe. In February of 1949, the now 46-year-old Don of the Ancelotti crime family, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, would move with his family into a spacious three-story Lower Easton compound on Luddite Row, which Ancelotti would have renovated to his exact specifications. Ancelotti, during this time, was known to run his day-to-day operations out of the Santa Maria Club on Emerald Street in Lower Easton, the former headquarters of Jack Ancelotti. In March of 1950, a distant cousin to Carlo Ancelotti, the great-grandson of Gioacchino Ancelotti's younger brother Giuseppe, 20-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti, would immigrate from Naples, Italy, to Liberty City, settling in an apartment on the corner of Feldspar Street and Albany Avenue in Lower Easton. Giovanni Ancelotti, who was born in 1930, would grow up in the crime-filled streets of Napoli and would begin his criminal career at just 15 during World War II, when Giovanni would run black market rackets supplying contraband to American troops stationed in Napoli. Over the years, as Giovanni would generate considerable earnings through this operation, Giovanni would become known around Napoli as a promising young gangster and would eventually be recruited into the mafia in Napoli. However, by 1949, as Giovanni would be caught in bed with the daughter of a prominent politician in Napoli, Giovanni Ancelotti would be forced to relocate to America. As Giovanni would arrive in Algonquin in March of 1950, Giovanni would immediately become acquainted with the Ancelottis of Liberty City, with whom he was directly related to. Soon, Giovanni Ancelotti would be recurrently invited to Don Carlo Ancelotti's home on Luddite Row, as well as several Ancelotti social clubs around Lower Easton. It was during this time Giovanni would build a close friendship with young Ancelotti associates, 19-year-old Carlo Ancelotti Jr., who was known in the streets simply as Junior, and 19-year-old Anthony Little Tony Boscarino Jr., the son of high-ranking Saladino crew soldier Tony Boscarino. By April of 1950, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would get Giovanni a high-paying job at the Alderney Fruit Market in Port Tudor, Alderney, where Giovanni would manage large fruit shipments. Soon, Giovanni Ancelotti, alongside little Tony Boscarino, who also worked in the Alderney Fruit Market, would develop a highly lucrative fencing operation out of the Alderney Fruit Market's Port Tudor warehouses, importing and exporting varieties of stolen contraband from the docks. In January of 1951, an Ancelotti social club on Vauxhall Street in East Holland would be raided by FIB agents. In this raid, several East Holland Ancelotti members would be arrested, including 64-year-old Ancelotti capo, Big Joe Cornudo. Eventually, as large amounts of heroin, illegal firearms, large amounts of cash, and gambling records would be found in the club, Cornudo, who was being accused of leading the crew, would be faced with major charges, as Big Joe Cornudo would be held for several days at an FIB office in upstate Liberty. The agents would unsuccessfully attempt to get information out of Cornudo, who would adamantly refuse to cooperate. However, the FIB agents, who knew Cornudo could be extremely detrimental to the Ancelottis if they could flip him, would persist in their interrogation, threatening Cornudo with 50 years in prison. Eventually, as FIB agents would tempt Cornudo with a Liberty City-style Italian sub-sandwich, Cornudo would immediately cave and agree to cooperate with the FIB. From January of 1951 to March of 1951, the FIB would carry out several interviews with Big Joe Cornudo, where Cornudo would talk about the many crimes he had committed, as well as providing the agents with a who's who of the Ancelotti crime family, explaining their organizational structure, places of operation, business interests, and rules and procedures. Cornudo would also explain to agents the meaning of Cosa Nostra, and describe in detail their initiation ceremony, which involved the pricking of the trigger finger, the burning of a saint card, and the oath of omerta, an Italian oath of silence. By April of 1951, as Big Joe Cornudo had become the first made member of Cosa Nostra to cooperate with the government since the formation of the commission, Cornudo would be called to testify at a congressional hearing, where Cornudo would give Congress a detailed explanation of the mafia in Liberty City, which had grown to become one of the government's greatest concerns. Soon, as a result of Big Joe Cornudo's cooperation with the government, Cornudo would have his many criminal charges wiped, and Cornudo would be placed in the Witness Protection Program and relocated to a remote part of Gloriana under a fake name. In June of 1951, Several East Holland Ancelotti soldiers would be taken down in a massive drug and racketeering sweep, including high-ranking members, 65-year-old Salvatore Sally the Wop Stabile, 60-year-old Dominic Big Sausage Sorello, and 57-year-old Giovanni Johnny the Bug Lombardo. Additionally, high-ranking Lower Easton soldiers, 55-year-old Tony Boscarino, and 61-year-old Dominic Wild Dom di Palermo would be sentenced to life in prison for murders they had committed with Big Joe Cornudo. While the family's administration, Carlo Ancelotti, Pete Ancelotti, and Donny DiGeronimo, would be left out from the charges that followed the Big Joe Cornudo testimonies, the FIB now had them, as well as the city's other mafia leaders, under the microscope of the law. By the summer of 1951, the FIB would assign 5 new organized crime divisions for each of the city's 5 families. By this time, high-ranking mob figures would be under constant surveillance, and federal agents would regularly begin using wiretaps and bugs to secretly record mob conversations. In Lower Easton, Carlo the Rope's Luddite Row home would by this time be under round-the-clock surveillance, as well as his headquarters, the Santa Maria Club on Emerald Street, and several other social clubs tied to the Ancelottis. While the Ancelottis during this time would continue to thrive in their respective territories, the FIB would now make their lives far more difficult. In January of 1952, the now 22-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti would be arrested on federal extortion charges for attempting to extort an Alderney labor union that operated out of Port Tudor. Ancelotti, who was now already on the FIB's radar as an Ancelotti family associate, would be sentenced to 3 years in this case. In March of 1952, powerful broker capo, 41-year-old Francesco, greaseball Frank Amato, would be arrested on federal racketeering charges for running a multi-million-dollar loan sharking operation based out of the South Slopes section of Broker. Soon, Greaseball Frank would be sentenced to 7 years in upstate Liberty. With Greaseball Frank away, the Ancelotti's broker crew that operated on Onondaga Avenue and Deadwood Street in South Slopes would be taken over by one of Amato's trusted soldiers, 53-year-old Frankie Butch Bertuzzi. By June of 1952, powerful Vice City capo, 37-year-old Anthony Ancelotti, along with several Vice City-based soldiers, would be arrested by federal agents in Leonida on racketeering charges in connection with a massive bookmaking and loan sharking operation spanning across Vice City. Subsequently, Anthony Ancelotti would be sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Following these high-profile busts in 1952, Carlo the Rope and the Ancelotti crime family would now place a great emphasis on keeping a low profile and evading law enforcement. In the late months of 1952, Carlo the Rope would order the execution of several Ancelotti soldiers and associates thought to be untrustworthy in hopes to avoid the damage of another Big Joe Cornudo. As a result, nearly a dozen men would be slain, none of whom were actual cooperators. By 1953, Carlo the Rope's now 22-year-old son, Junior Ancelotti, was leading a tough crew of young Italian gangsters in Lower Easton. The Junior Ancelotti crew, which was led by Junior Ancelotti and Little Tony Boscarino, was a violent group of young thugs known for stick-ups, hijackings, and burglaries. Additionally, the Junior Ancelotti crew, which served as a feeder team for the larger Ancelotti crime family, was also known to war with local greaser gangs in Broker and Algonquin, who they would commonly exchange gunfire with. In May of 1953, when Junior Ancelotti would be charged with assault by LCPD officers for stabbing a member of the Hematite Cobra's street gang in Easton, Carlo the Rope would arrange for his son's charges to be dropped at City Hall. By this point in 1953, East Holland capo, 53-year-old Nicky Slick Lombardo, who had absorbed many of the rackets in East Holland left behind by Big Joe Cornudo, had become one of the most powerful figures within the Ancelotti crime family. Nicky Slick, who lived in a large home in East Holland on the corner of Vauxhall Street and Bismarck Avenue, was well-liked and respected around Liberty City, and was leading a massive crew in East Holland, involved in high-level loan sharking, gambling, and extortion, as well as controlling the lucrative heroin market around uptown Algonquin. Lombardo during this time would operate his day-to-day operations out of the Friends of Ours social club on Vauxhall Street, where Ancelotti associates in East Holland would be known to congregate in large groups. In summer of 1955, the now 25-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti would be released from prison after serving 3 years. Not long after, as a reward for Ancelotti's first bit in prison, Giovanni Ancelotti would be inducted as a made member of the Ancelotti crime family, in a ceremony held by Carlo the Rope at the Santa Maria Club on Emerald Street. Also inducted during this ceremony was Carlo the Rope's son, Junior Ancelotti, as well as Junior's right-hand man, Little Tony Boscarino Jr., who was operating several lucrative rackets out of the Alderney Fruit Market. Upon the induction of these new Ancelotti recruits, the three of them would be placed in a powerful Saladino crew, led by 62-year-old acting capo, Vito Di Simone. However, just weeks after this induction ceremony, Giovanni Ancelotti and little Tony Boscarino would be brought up in federal court and eventually sentenced each to 4 years in prison for operating a massive loan sharking operation out of the Alderney Fruit Market. In 1956, former Ancelotti family soldier Joe Cornuto, while living in the Witness Protection Program in Gloriana, would publish an autobiography titled This Thing of Ours, Life in the Mafia, a tell-all book about Joe Cornuto's life in the Ancelotti crime family. Following the release of this book, which would go on to become a Liberty Trees bestseller, the 5 families in Liberty City would become enraged, and as a result, many within the commission would grow increasingly weary of the Ancelotti family. Also in 1956, longtime Ancelotti heavyweight, 61-year-old Joseph Joe the Killer Saladino would be released after serving 10 years in prison. Upon the release of Saladino would regain his capo position over his massive crew in Lower Easton. In 1958, the FIB would launch a probe into the notorious Alderney Casino, which was quietly under the control of mob figures like Carlo the Rope Ancelotti and Marco the Typewriter Centrella. However, after a year of investigation, the FIB would be unable to prove any mafia connection. In 1959, more internal strife would rise within the Ancelottis when a soldier in the family's broker crew, 46-year-old little Joey Bertuzzi, would slap Anthony Ancelotti's 19-year-old son Tommy Ancelotti at a crowded street fest in Schottler Broker. Subsequently, as the imprisoned Anthony Ancelotti would get word of this incident, Ancelotti would order the death of little Joey Bertuzzi from behind bars. Soon, as rumors began to spread in the street of Joey Bertuzzi slapping Anthony Ancelotti's son, Bertuzzi's capo, Greaseball Frank Amato, would advise Bertuzzi to go on the lam, and soon Bertuzzi would begin to hide out in upstate Liberty. Eventually, as Anthony Ancelotti would continue to call for Bertuzzi's death from prison, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would order Greaseball Frank to find little Joey Bertuzzi and take him out himself. Greaseball Frank, however, who had a close relationship with Bertuzzi and his family, would soon decide to defy the Rope's wishes, something that he knew could get him killed. In July of 1959, as Greaseball Frank Amato exited his social club on Onondaga Avenue in Broker, Amato would be hailed with gunfire from a car waiting out front. However, despite being shot twice in the leg, Greaseball Frank would survive this attack and begin to plot his retaliation. Greaseball Frank, who had long ran the Ancelotti family's broker presence, led a massive crew of violent Ancelotti gangsters that were known to be loyal to Greaseball Frank, more so than the Ancelotti bosses in Algonquin. Soon, with Amato recovering from gunshot wounds in the Schottler Medical Center, the broker Ancelottis would make their move. In August of 1959, members of Greaseball Frank's crew would storm a restaurant on Columbus Avenue in Lower Easton, opening fire at several high-ranking Ancelotti figures as they dined. In this attack, 60-year-old Ancelotti family consigliere, Petey Bullets Ancelotti, would be shot in the torso, but would manage to survive. The following day, 65-year-old Tony Mastrantonio, a Lower Easton plumber who shared a resemblance to Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, would be shot and killed on the corner of Feldspar Street and Albany Avenue in a case of mistaken identity. By the late months of 1959, Greaseball Frank Amato, who was hitting the mattresses with his crew, hiding in various safe houses around Liberty City, would divorce his wife Donatella and begin seeing popular Vinewood movie star, 26-year-old Barbara Lovecock. Soon, as Greaseball Frank Amato would enter a serious relationship with Lovecock, Amato would fully distance himself from the Ancelotti crime family, which was actively trying to kill him. By February of 1960, Amato and Lovecock would move out west into the Vinewood Hills section of Los Santos San Andreas, and by this time Greaseball Frank would begin pursuing a career as a Vinewood actor. During this time, as Greaseball Frank would rub elbows with many celebrities and business moguls in Vinewood, many of his loyalists in Broker would be slain on the orders of Carlo the Rope. Soon, a powerful Broker soldier, 56-year-old Gino Garlic Breath Generoso, who had maintained a close relationship with Carlo the Rope Ancelotti and the family's administration, would take over the remaining Ancelotti operations and broker. Generoso, who had beaten 8 homicide cases in broker, was a seasoned and respected gangster who had close ties to many of the Ancelotti soldiers in Algonquin. By the early months of 1960, as Garlic Breath Generoso would take out several broker mobsters thought to be disloyal to the family, several members of the former Greaseball Frank Amato crew, including Little Joey Bertuzzi, were still hiding out in remote areas of Liberty City. By 1961, Frank Amato, who had gained considerable wealth during his time as an Ancelotti capo, was now living the high life in Los Santos, driving a luxury Anus sedan, wearing clothes from Didier Sachs and Derriere, and co-starring in several forgettable Vinewood film productions. However, in 1962, after Amato's 30-year-old wife, Barbara Lovecock, would die from an apparent overdose, Amato would abandon Vinewood and return home to Liberty City. In May of 1962, Frank Amato would quietly move into an apartment on Ivy Drive South in the upscale Algonquin neighborhood of Middle Park West. Soon, Greaseball Frank, who the Ancelottis desperately wanted to take out, would begin to casually reestablish himself around Middle Park West. In June of 1962, Amato would open a small art exhibit on the corner of Pyrite Street and Galveston Avenue, where Amato would display various pieces of expensive art, mostly depicting nude women. Additionally, Greaseball Frank during this time would begin meeting with his old crew around Middle Park West, where they would dine at bars and restaurants, drink copious amounts of liquor, and use drugs like marijuana and cocaine. Eventually, as Greaseball Frank's antics in Algonquin would reach the ears of the Ancelotti family, Carlo the Rope would begin to plan his execution. In March of 1963, after a night of drinking at a Star Junction jazz club, Greaseball Frank Amato, along with 3 friends, would visit a diner on the corner of Nickel Street and Albany Avenue late in the night. Soon after, as Amato and his friends would finish eating and exit the diner, Amato would be shot 7 times and killed at the age of 52. This hit, which was carried out by broker Ancelotti soldiers led by Gino Generoso, would go on to make major headlines around the country. In July of 1963, more problems would arise for the Ancelottis, when a high-ranking Lupacella soldier, 56-year-old Wayne the Mouse Nicodera, would discover that his wife had been having an affair with East Holland Ancelotti soldier, 45-year-old Vito, the Pitbull Graziani. Graziani, who was a longtime enforcer in the Nicky Slick Lombardo crew, operated several rackets on Vauxhall Street in East Holland, and was known as one of the toughest mobsters in the crew. Wayne the Mouse Nicodera was a longtime highly respected Lupacella soldier who was well connected around the city and had been responsible for multiple hits over the years. Upon learning of the affair, as Nicodera would be too embarrassed to reveal this information to the Lupacellas, Nicodera would decide to drive over to East Holland himself to confront Graziani. In July of 1963, Wayne the Mouse Nicodera would enter Vito the Pitbull Graziani's pizzeria on Denver Avenue and Xenotime Street after hours. In this exchange, as Nicodera would attempt to assault Graziani, Graziani, who was much larger than Nicodera, would proceed to brutally beat Nicodera, breaking several bones in his face and causing him to be hospitalized. Following this, as the then 34-year-old Don of the Lupacella family, Vincent Lupacella, would hear what had happened in East Holland, Lupacella, who had a reputation throughout the city as a deranged killer, would put a hit out on Vito the Pitbull Graziani for what he considered to be multiple commission rule violations. In August of 1963, 3 Lupacella enforcers would visit the same pizzeria on Denver Avenue after hours, where they would proceed to shoot Vito Graziani 11 times, killing him at the age of 45. Also killed in this attack was Graziani's 46-year-old brother, Nicholas "Nick the Wizard" Graziani. The following day, as shockwaves were being sent through the Ancelotti family, Carlo the Rope would order an immediate response. Just hours later, Junior Ancelotti and Little Tony Boscarino would drive past a Lupacella social club in Little Bay Bohan, where they would open fire with automatic weapons, taking out several soldiers and associates. By this point, in August of 1963, the Second Ancelotti Lupacella War had been officially waged, and the streets of Liberty City would now once again be swept with violence. From 1963 into 1964, more than 25 shootings would be attributed to the Second Ancelotti Lupacella War, as many of the Ancelotti members during this time would hit the mattresses, living on the lam in discreet safe houses in and around Liberty City. Eventually, under the advice of Ancelotti family consigliere Peter Ancelotti, Carlo the Rope would in February of 1965 call for a sit-down with Lupicella family Don, Vincent Lupicella. Soon, Lupicella, Ancelotti, and several other important mob figures would sit down at a commission meeting in upstate Liberty, where the beef would be officially settled, ending the war. While the Second Ancelotti-Lupicella War would be ended at this point, a rivalry would go on to remain between these families for generations to come. By 1966, the now 35-year-old Carlo Ancelotti Jr. would be officially made a captain within the Ancelotti crime family, as Jr. was now rising as a top player in the family. By this point, the Junior Ancelotti crew in Lower Easton had become the family's highest-earning crew, with a loan sharking operation that earned millions annually. Additionally, Junior during this time was running a major car theft ring around Liberty City, where Junior and his crew would ship stolen cars to the Enrico Ancelotti crew in Canada, where the Canadian Ancelottis would distribute the cars throughout Canada and parts of Europe. This scheme would generate major earnings for the family. In January of 1967, the now 37-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti would be released from prison after serving 7 years for the murder of a rival loan shark. Upon the release of Ancelotti, Ancelotti would be given ownership of the Alderney fruit market, which he would use as his base of operations. In May of 1967, tensions would once again rise for the Ancelotti family, when the multi-million-dollar renovation contract for a well-known low-rise hotel building, Fife Palace, on the corner of Emerald Street and Columbus Avenue, would be signed into the control of broker-based Messina family soldier Frank the Guinea Gizzo. Fife Palace, which was across the street from Jack Ancelotti's original building on Columbus Avenue and Emerald Street, had long been frequented by the Ancelottis and was a landmark in the heart of their neighborhood. Additionally, this project, which was to generate millions in city money, was originally intended to be controlled by the Ancelottis, before Frank Gizzo and his crew would strong-arm the Liberty City Trade Workers Union, taking over the job. As a result of this, as Carlo the Rope would become enraged, the Rope would send enforcers from the Junior Ancelotti crew to storm Frank the Guinea Gizzo's social club in Schottler Broker, with the message that Gizzo was to hand over 50% of the Fife Palace project, or war would ensue. While Frank the Guinea Gizzo was absent in the social club, several high-ranking soldiers from the Messina family's Earp Street crew were present, and a tension-filled standoff would ensue. As the Ancelotti enforcers left the social club, someone from the Messina family's Earp Street crew would open fire on their vehicle, and while no one was shot, a new war was now brewing for the Ancelotti family. Just days later, on the orders of Carlo the Rope, trusted Lower Easton hitmen, Dante Ancelotti and Johnny the Ape Boscarino would shoot Frank the Guinea Gizzo 12 times as he exited a dentist's office in Beechwood City Broker, killing him at the age of 52. The following day, Carlo the Rope would send Giovanni Ancelotti and his crew to stick up Frank the Guinea's social club in Schottler Broker, where the crew would come away with $80,000 in cash, several firearms, and several pieces of expensive jewelry. By this point in the summer of 1967, the message from the Ancelotti family was loud and clear, and soon the Messina family's feared and experienced leader, 72-year-old Mario Messina, would plot his family's retaliation. In July of 1967, Messina hitmen would drive past Carlo the Rope's Lower Easton home, where they would open fire with machine guns, sending more than 100 shots through Ancelotti's windows. While Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would survive this attack, his 62-year-old brother, Dante Ancelotti, would be shot in the head and killed, and the Rope's youngest son, 25-year-old Bruno Ancelotti, would be shot multiple times. Following these events, an all-out war had broken out in the streets of Liberty City, and while the commission would attempt to step in and resolve the situation, there would be no stopping the violence. In September of 1967, trusted Lower Easton hitman Johnny the Ape Boscarino would take out high-ranking Messina family captain, 75-year-old Franco the Fist Nunziata, shooting him multiple times in front of a pizzeria in Dukes. The following day, trusted broker hitmen Joe Mazzola, Freddie LaDusa, and Mikey Gamiello would drive past Mario Messina's home on Bunker Hill Avenue in Cerveza Heights, Dukes, where they would send a barrage of bullets through his windows, in an attack similar to the one carried out at Carlo the Rope's home a month prior. While Messina's home was significantly damaged in this attack, Messina had already been hiding out with his family in several discreet apartments around the city, and no one would be shot in the attack in Cerveza Heights. In December of 1967, Mario Messina would meet with Gambetti family boss Sonny Cangelosi and Pavano family underboss Charlie Valvona in a sit-down held at the Little Italy Leisure Center on Denver Avenue. In this sit-down, Cangelosi, Valvona, and Messina, who would meet late in the night to avoid attention, would discuss various construction and waste management issues. However, Messina, who arrived in a flashy black Albany Emperor, would be spotted on Denver Avenue by members of the Junior Ancelotti crew, and soon a hit team would prepare to take out Messina. After the sit-down, as Messina and his bodyguards would leave, they would be tailed by an Ancelotti hit car, and after following Messina for several blocks, the hitmen would send shots through Messina's windows on the corner of Garnett Street and Bismarck Avenue. In this shooting, all 4 of the passengers in Messina's Albany would be shot. However, Messina, as well as his driver Joey D'Annunzio, would be able to narrowly survive. Following this, 72-year-old Mario Messina, who was shot twice in the hip and shoulder, was briefly hospitalized at City Hall Hospital in Algonquin, before being transferred to Schottler Medical Center, where he would stay for 4 weeks in recovery, under heavy security. Not long after, unrelated to the Ancelotti-Messina War, Junior Ancelotti's right-hand man, 36-year-old Tony Boscarino Jr., would die from a heroin overdose while hiding out in a safe house in the Fortside section of Bohan. As the Ancelotti family went into the year 1968, their operations would be almost entirely halted due to the ongoing war with the Messinas, as both Ancelotti and Messina soldiers would be living on the lam. However, the Messinas during this time, who were a violent family based out of Cerveza Heights Dukes, known to be fiercely loyal to Don Mario Messina, would swear revenge against Carlo the Rope, and the many Messina street crews would now be scrambling to take him out. In February of 1968, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, Big Donnie DiGeronimo, and several Ancelotti bodyguards would attend a sit-down with Gambetti family consigliere Rocco Pernice and Lupacella family captain Peter Aiello in the back of a social club on Dillon Street in Schottler Broker. During this sit-down, Carlo the Rope would negotiate his family's control over lucrative underground brothels being operated around the city. Following this sit-down, Ancelotti would insist that his bodyguards drive him to a well-known downtown broker restaurant, Tomasino's, on the corner of Montauk Avenue and Dillon Street. Inside Tomasino's, Ancelotti and his men would enjoy a 4-course meal, including pizza, pasta, veal, fish, several bottles of wine, and sfogliatella for dessert. Unbeknownst to Ancelotti, however, was that as he and his men enjoyed their feast, word of Ancelotti's presence in downtown Broker would rapidly spread around the neighborhood, and soon Messina hitmen would circle the area. As Carlo the Rope and his men would make their exit, they would be ambushed by Messina hitmen who would shoot Carlo the Rope Ancelotti 8 times in the face and body, killing him at the age of 65. Shortly after this, Carlo Ancelotti would be pronounced dead at the scene, and Ancelotti's underboss, Big Donnie DiGeronimo, would be rushed to the hospital with several gunshot wounds. As shockwaves rang through the Ancelotti crime family, it would be decided among several senior members that Carlo the Rope's 37-year-old son, Carlo Ancelotti Jr., would be named the family's new Don. Days later, a funeral service would be held for Carlo Ancelotti at the Columbus Cathedral, where Junior Ancelotti would be officially recognized as the new boss of the Ancelotti crime family. Junior Ancelotti, who by 1968 had become one of Liberty City's most powerful mob figures, would now take over his father's various business interests around the city and begin to organize the family's new structure. Although Junior Ancelotti by this point had moved with his family into a spacious home on Caribou Avenue, in the quiet suburban area of West Dyke Alderney, Ancelotti held tremendous power down in Lower Easton and was known to run his day-to-day operations out of a social club on the corner of Feldspar Street and Bismarck Avenue. Junior, who was raised by one of Liberty City's most infamous criminals ever, was a tough and ruthless gangster who had been involved in countless murders throughout his life. Additionally, Junior Ancelotti led a massive crew of loyal soldiers in Lower Easton, known to generate major earnings, and kill for Junior at the drop of a hat. Soon Junior, who was devastated following the loss of his father, would begin to plot his vengeance. In March of 1968, Junior Ancelotti and Ancelotti family consigliere, 69-year-old Peter Ancelotti, would meet several times at Junior's social club on Feldspar Street to plan the death of Mario Messina. During these meetings, Junior and Peter Ancelotti would discuss several potential plots, from rigging Mario Messina's car with a bomb to sending a high-end prostitute to seduce and poison Messina. However, during this time, as Junior Ancelotti would build a relationship with powerful Pavano family don, Marco the typewriter Centrella would convince Ancelotti not to make the same mistakes as his father, urging Ancelotti to make peace. In April of 1968, Junior Ancelotti, Peter Ancelotti, Nicky Lombardo, Marco Centrella, Charlie Valvona, Vincent Lupicella, Peter Aiello, Mario Messina, and Vincent Scordo would all meet after hours at popular Lower Easton restaurant, Fuds's Delicatessen, in a commission meeting. At this meeting, the commission would approach Junior Ancelotti with the offer of several top-echelon construction projects in Broker and Algonquin, a construction company that was owned by the Messina family's Earp Street crew, and new Union interest in various areas of the city, in exchange for a complete stand-down in the Ancelotti-Messina War. Upon hearing this offer, Junior Ancelotti, while distraught over the loss of his father, would realize the wealth he could gain from ending the war, and would accept this deal at Fuds's Delicatessen. Soon, Junior would order his street crews to stand down, and the Ancelotti-Messina War would officially be ended. Just a week after the sit-down at Fuds's Delicatessen, legendary Pavano crime family don, Marco the typewriter Centrella, would die from natural causes at the age of 71 in Sicily. Following the death of Centrella, the Pavanos would name his 52-year-old underboss, Cesario Charlie Valvona, as the family's new don. Soon Valvona, who had worked closely with Junior Ancelotti in overseeing the Alderney Casino, would form a close alliance with the Ancelotti family, much like Centrella had before him. By June of 1968, as Ancelotti family underboss, Big Donnie DiGeronimo recovered at his Lower Easton home after being shot multiple times in Broker. DiGeronimo would be brought up on federal extortion and corruption charges in connection to his direct involvement in bribes being made at City Hall. Soon, as this case gained momentum in the summer of 1968, Ancelotti family consigliere, 69-year-old Peter Bullets Ancelotti, would be implicated and eventually indicted. Soon, Ancelotti, DiGeronimo, and several corrupt city officials would be sent to federal prison after the commissioner of the Liberty City Department of Buildings would cooperate with the FIB. With these key administrative figures put away, Junior Ancelotti would appoint two of his close loyalists, 64-year-old Johnny the Ape Boscarino as the family's new underboss, and 39-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti as the family's new consigliere. In August of 1968, Junior Ancelotti would begin having an affair with a 35-year-old woman from Broker named Betty Randazzo. Ancelotti, who had been approached by Randazzo in a Lower Easton bar, would eventually begin regularly seeing Randazzo at her apartment in Hove Beach, unbeknownst to his wife Antoinette. Ancelotti and Randazzo, who shared a mutual love of profanity, chain smoking, binge drinking, and rough sex, would quickly form a serious relationship, and Ancelotti would be known to spend several nights a week with Randazzo. However, by December of 1968, when FIB agents would arrest Junior Ancelotti at his Alderney home in the middle of the night, it would be revealed to Ancelotti that Randazzo had in fact been an undercover FIB agent, and that Randazzo had placed a bug in Ancelotti's Albany Emperor, which had recorded several months' worth of incriminating mob conversation. Ancelotti, who had been recorded discussing murders, union extortion, waste management extortion, and drug trafficking, as well as receiving financial tributes from known members, would now quickly realize that he would likely be facing serious time in federal prison and would no longer be able to live his life of luxury. Ancelotti, who was a man of intense greed and pride, lacked the honor that many of his contemporaries in Liberty City were said to have. Ancelotti, who was born to a wealthy father, never worked a day in his life, and was taught from a young age to extort, intimidate, and cheat his way through life, putting himself before everyone else around him. While Ancelotti was a dedicated member of the Mafia, whose very surname carried on the tradition of a crime family, the FIB would soon prey upon Junior Ancelotti's selfish ways. After several hours of interrogation at the FIB headquarters on the corner of Jade Street and Albany Avenue, Junior Ancelotti would eventually reach a deal with the FIB, agreeing to act as a confidential informant against his family in return for immunity for his crimes. Soon, the FIB would use Ancelotti to provide intelligence and put away gangsters, and Ancelotti would use the FIB as his safety net to do whatever he wanted in the street. By the early months of 1969, Junior Ancelotti would provide the FIB with information that would lead to the arrest of several Lower Easton Ancelotti soldiers, including longtime soldier 76-year-old handsome Paulie Giannetti, who was a known rival of Junior Ancelotti. Not long after, with the permission of the FIB, Junior would begin putting hits on several Ancelotti soldiers thought to be disloyal or subversive. Also during this time, Junior would begin providing the FIB with information on other families, using his informant status to eliminate his closest competitors, elevating himself in the underworld. During the summer of 1969, Alderney State Police, alongside the Alderney office of the FIB, would launch a probe into the Alderney Casino, and after a month-long investigation, several corrupt casino officials, Ancelotti figures, and Pavano figures would be indicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges. As a result of this, the Ancelotti family would lose their control of the Alderney Casino. However, Ancelotti family boss, Junior Ancelotti, would not be named in the indictments due to his confidential informant status. By the year 1970, Liberty City had evolved into a city far different than it had been in the days of Jack Ancelotti. The Lower Easton neighborhood, which had historically been known as a massive Italian enclave dominated by the Ancelotti family, was now reduced to a small patch from Emerald Street up to Garnet Street and from Columbus Avenue over to Borlock Road. This happened as the city would officially recognize the Chinatown neighborhood to the south of Lower Easton, which stretched from Emerald Street down to Calcium Street. While the neighborhood borders would change during this time, demographics would change as well. By 1970, Liberty City had just experienced its most significant influx of Chinese immigration ever, as nearly 70,000 Chinese immigrants would settle in Liberty City from 1965 to 1970. As this happened, the vast majority of Chinese immigrants would settle in the area of Diamond Street and Bismarck Avenue, which was now being referred to as Chinatown. As this was happening, to the north of Lower Easton, the Easton neighborhood would begin to evolve as well. By 1970, the Governor Greg R. Smith housing projects in Easton, which were situated along Albany Avenue just north of Garnet Street, had become a hub for drug use, prostitution, and gang violence, which would regularly spill into the Lower Easton neighborhood. Soon, the criminal activity taking place around the Governor Greg R. Smith housing projects, paired with the mafia activity in Lower Easton, would make this section of the Lower East Side undesirable for many young families. It was during this time, Italians who once made up a massive population in Lower Easton would begin rapidly moving out of the neighborhood, favoring quieter areas like Dukes, Broker, Alderney, and upstate Liberty. Another area that was experiencing changes at the time was the uptown Algonquin neighborhood of East Holland. East Holland, which had long been considered an Italian-American stronghold, had by 1970 been given the nickname Spanish Holland for the neighborhood's large population of Hispanics, particularly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. On the street, East Holland had by this point become an extremely dangerous area, with street gangs, namely the Warlords, the Spanish Lords, the Puerto Rican Stars, and the Phantoms, terrorizing the area. Despite this, the area still held a strong mafia presence, with both the Ancelotti and Pavano crime families operating in the neighborhood. During this time, an Italian-American street gang would rise on the streets of East Holland, calling themselves the East Holland Purple Gang. The Purple Gang, which was led by tough young gangsters from East Holland, like Bruce Principato, Carlo Baccoli, and Raymond Pitofsky, were a violent and well-connected street gang that held territory on various street corners around East Holland and struck fear into the rivaling neighborhood gangs. Soon the Purple Gang would work closely in East Holland with both the Ancelotti and Pavano crime families, working for powerful mobsters like Nicky Slick Lombardo and Joe the Show Villapiano. By the spring of 1970, the Ancelottis would develop yet another feud, this time with the notorious Gambetti crime family. This began in April of 1970, when powerful East Holland Ancelotti soldier, 56-year-old Joe the Boxer Iannello, would develop a beef with 54-year-old Gambetti soldier Ralph the Pudge Leonetti. Leonetti, who was a longtime Gambetti soldier in the Remo Grosso crew down in Little Italy, was highly connected, highly wealthy, and was considered a construction tycoon in Lower Algonquin. Leonetti, who had recently taken over a lucrative construction project in President City, would push out the local street sweepers union from the job, which was ran by Joe the Boxer Iannello, opting to instead use his own private cleanup crew. As a result of this, Iannello, who is a habitual user of cocaine, known for his bad temperament and poor decision-making, would send several members of the East Holland Purple Gang to the site, where they would destroy a building that was in development, cause the explosion of a $75,000 crane, and brutally beat several of Leonetti's union representatives. Just days later, when Leonetti would catch wind of Iannello's involvement in the attack at the construction site, Leonetti would respond, when Gambetti enforcers would brutally beat Joe the Boxer Iannello in front of his wife and daughter as they dined at a restaurant on Brown Place in Little Italy. Following this, as Iannello would be enraged about the beating, Iannello would get approval from Junior Ancelotti to put a hit out on Ralph the Pudge Leonetti. The following week, trusted East Holland hitman, 49-year-old Michael Sorello, would shoot Ralph the Pudge Leonetti in the head with a .45 caliber revolver inside of a barbershop on Columbus Avenue, killing Leonetti at the age of 54. With the death of Leonetti, a high-ranking Gambetti soldier, the Second Ancelotti-Gambetti War would be officially waged. Months later, in July of 1970, the Gambettis would retaliate when Joe the Boxer Iannello would be shot and killed as he dined at a Lower Easton restaurant on the corner of Columbus Avenue and Emerald Street. Following this, Ancelotti and Gambetti street crews would begin regularly opening fire at each other around both Algonquin and Broker, and many soldiers would be forced to hit the mattresses during this time. By March of 1971, after several months of shootouts, beatings, and financial stalemates, the Ancelotti-Gambetti conflict would reach a boiling point when Junior Ancelotti would order soldiers from the Nicky Slick Lombardo crew to hold back on paying powerful Gambetti captain, Remo Grosso, his share of a construction deal they had entered back in 1969, which had totaled more than $3 million. Remo Grosso, who was considered one of Liberty City's most influential mob figures, would soon become livid over the Ancelotti's disrespect, and alongside Gambetti family Don, Sonny Cangelosi, would go on to plot a complete decimation of the Ancelotti crime family. Then, in March of 1971, powerful Ancelotti family underboss, 66-year-old Johnny the Ape Boscarino, would be shot and killed by Gambetti hitmen outside of his home on Albany Avenue in Lower Easton. The following day, in a devastating move, the Gambettis would take out three high-ranking Ancelotti captains, 55-year-old Anthony Ancelotti, 75-year-old Joseph Saladino, and 73-year-old Alphonse Licavoli, as they met at a social club on Garnett Street in Lower Easton. Following the losses of these key administrative figures in the Ancelotti family, the Ancelottis would be forced to regroup and reorganize as they plotted their retaliation against the Gambettis. By June of 1971, the Ancelottis would strike back, when Ancelotti enforcers would shoot up Gambetti family boss, Sonny Cangelosi's broker headquarters, the Italian-American Civic Improvement Center in Hove Beach. While no one was killed in this attack, the message was clear, and the Gambettis were livid. Following this, on a cold February morning in 1972, a feared Gambetti captain from Hove Beach, 49-year-old John Gravelli, would take matters into his own hands. Gravelli, who had been watching Ancelotti for weeks, would follow Junior Ancelotti and his driver, 56-year-old Angelo Matteo, as they drove from Junior's home in Westdyke to Junior's social club on Feldspar Street and Bismarck Avenue. Gravelli, after watching Ancelotti and Matteo make their entrance, would proceed to follow them into the social club, shooting and killing Angelo Matteo and holding Junior Ancelotti at gunpoint. Ancelotti, who begged Gravelli for his life, would be spared by Gravelli, but not before vowing to end his war against the Gambettis. With this, the war would be officially ended, and peace would be restored within the commission. Following the events of the Second Ancelotti-Gambetti War, Junior Ancelotti would restructure the family during the year 1972. By this point, the now 42-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti would be serving as both the family's underboss and consigliere, while also running a massive crew around Lower Easton, Alderney City, and the suburban Alderney towns of Berkham and Actor. Giovanni Ancelotti during this time resided with his wife Anna Marie in a spacious home on Babbage Drive in Actor that he had purchased in 1970, and around this time, Ancelotti would establish the Actor neighborhood as his primary territory. Ancelotti would operate his day-to-day operations out of the Alderney Fruit Market building on Rand Avenue in Alderney City, which served as the Ancelotti family's Alderney headquarters. In Lower Easton, the Ancelottis had another powerful street crew led by 51-year-old Anthony "Tony Bones" Licavoli that controlled various rackets around Lower Algonquin. In East Holland, longtime Ancelotti family heavyweight, 72-year-old Nicky "Slick" Lombardo, served as the godfather of the neighborhood, running a powerful street crew, known for running the heroin trade in Algonquin. In Broker, the Ancelottis had two major street crews led by 64-year-old Gino "Garlic Breath" Generoso and 63-year-old Freddie LaDusa that ran gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics rackets out of tough Broker neighborhoods like Shotler, South Slopes, and Outlook Park. In Canada, the Ancelottis maintained a strong presence, ran by notorious Canadian Ancelotti captain, 69-year-old Enrico Ancelotti, and his 37-year-old son Ricky. Additionally, the Ancelottis maintained a presence down in Leonida, ran by longtime Vice City Ancelotti figure, 57-year-old Slow Tony Giannetti. In May of 1974, tragedy would strike Giovanni and Anna Marie Ancelotti when their first and only son, 7-year-old Giuseppe Ancelotti, would drown in just 3 inches of water. By 1975, a new criminal organization had arose in the Chinatown neighborhood, ran by 60-year-old Chinese immigrant, Wang Jin, or as he was known on the street, Johnny Wang. Johnny Wang, who grew up poor during the 1920s on the outskirts of Hong Kong, had familial ties to a secret criminal society in China dating back to the 1700s, known commonly as the Triads. By the 1950s, Johnny Wang had become a prominent leader of a triad group in China that had been enlisted by the government to attack political enemies and carry out assassinations. However, when regime change would occur in the early 1960s, causing the Triads to come under fire, Wang and much of his family would be forced to flee China. By 1965, Wang would immigrate with his family to Liberty City, settling in the Chinatown section of the Lower East Side. Chinatown, which had always been a hotbed for illegal gambling, would soon serve as the base for Johnny Wang and the Wang Triad to establish criminal operations, just as they had in China. By the early 1970s, Johnny Wang, alongside his first cousin, Xin Zhaoming, had built a full-scale criminal operation out of Chinatown, controlling gambling, prostitution, drug trafficking, and arms trafficking. It was around this time Johnny Wang would establish ties with powerful Ancelotti captain Tony Licavoli. Licavoli, who had been extorting Johnny Wang and the Triads for several years, would by 1974 begin funding massive heroin shipments to be shipped into the Algonquin fish market through Johnny Wang's connections in China. Soon, a new form of heroin would hit the streets, known as China White, a cleaner, highly potent form of heroin, which would soon become highly sought after among the many junkies on the Liberty City streets. By 1975, East Holland Ancelotti heroin kingpin Nicky "Slick" Lombardo would begin ordering massive shipments of China White through Johnny Wang's connections. The Lombardo crew, who had long been known as the heroin kings of Liberty City, would soon begin distributing Chinese heroin out of numerous small pizzerias around the Liberty City metropolitan area, as well as supplying the many street gangs on the streets of uptown Algonquin. Also during this time, the Ancelottis in Canada would too begin ordering large shipments of heroin through Johnny Wang, distributing China White throughout Canada. This massive drug operation, which would become known as the Chinese Connection, would go on to generate millions for both the Ancelottis and the now growing Liberty City Triads. By 1976, a theory was developing within certain circles of the Ancelotti crime family that their leader, Junior Ancelotti, could have been a federal informant. This was mainly due to Junior's ability to stay out of federal indictments, while many of his rivals in the family would be consistently taken down. One of the main proponents of this theory was longtime Ancelotti captain, Nicky "Slick" Lombardo. Nicky "Slick", who was 31 years older than Junior, was a heavyweight within the family, viewed in East Holland as somewhat of a boss in his own right, and despite being only a captain, Lombardo was known to have direct influence in the commission. Soon, Lombardo would be known to badmouth Junior Ancelotti, labeling him as a rat, not to be trusted. While many in areas like East Holland and Broker would maintain their allegiance to Junior Ancelotti during this time, there would now be a growing contingent of Ancelotti soldiers that had developed a distrust for their leader. Junior, who had observed this, would soon begin to strategically purge his family of its subversive members. In November of 1976, Nicky Slick Lombardo would be shot several times in broad daylight outside of the Friends of Ours social club on Vauxhall Street in East Holland. Lombardo would later be pronounced dead at the age of 76 after several failed blood transfusions at the Holland Hospital Center. The hit, which was carried out on the orders of Junior Ancelotti, would go on to send shockwaves through the Ancelotti family and add to the fear that surrounded Junior Ancelotti. Following the death of Lombardo, Junior and Giovanni Ancelotti would appoint a close ally, 54-year-old Salvatore Bucky Alonso, to run the Ancelotti's powerful East Holland crew. Bucky Alonso, who by the late 1970s had become one of the most feared criminals on the streets of uptown Algonquin, was a well-respected, old-school gangster who came up in East Holland under the tutelage of old-world mafiosi like Nicky Slick Lombardo and Uncle Joe Cazzo. Alonso, who had been involved primarily in gambling throughout his career, had one of Algonquin's most lucrative underground poker rings, as well as a sports gambling operation that spanned across the city. Alonso, who was known to have a close connection with the East Holland Purple Gang, would soon use the Purple Gang to move large amounts of drugs for his crew, earning them millions. In January of 1977, Junior would arrange for another one of his critics to be rubbed out, this time longtime Lower Easton powerhouse, 56-year-old Anthony Tony Bones Licavoli. This would transpire when Licavoli would be summoned to have dinner at Junior Ancelotti's home in Westdyke, where he would eventually be beaten to death by Junior and Giovanni Ancelotti, who would later dispose of his body at a meatpacking factory in the meat quarter. With the death of Licavoli, who was formerly tasked with overseeing the family's historic Lower Easton crew, Junior would appoint trusted Lower Easton soldier, 63-year-old James Jimmy the Gravedigger Palazzolo, as the new captain of the crew. Jimmy the Gravedigger Palazzolo, who was a lifelong Lower Easton resident, had a reputation in the neighborhood as a deranged lunatic. Palazzolo, who committed his first murder at just 12 years old in 1926 and was rumored to have committed more than 100 murders throughout his life, was said to have a sick infatuation with the act of murder, and it was known that Palazzolo would regularly kill people in Lower Easton, seemingly for no reason at all. Palazzolo additionally was said to enjoy the hobby of grave digging, both in an attempt to steal any valuables, as well as for his fascination with corpses, and after being arrested in 1939 for grave digging, Palazzolo had long been known under the nickname Jimmy the Gravedigger. Soon, Jimmy the Gravedigger would run Lower Easton with impunity, using his reputation to shake down and intimidate anyone he could. In May of 1977, Giovanni Ancelotti's wife, Anna Marie, would give birth to their first daughter, Grace Ancelotti. By this time, Giovanni Ancelotti, who operated out of the Alderney Fruit Market building on Rand Avenue in Alderney City, had become a multimillionaire. Between Giovanni's ownership of the Alderney Fruit Market, his ownership of several construction companies, and his interest in street rackets in both Algonquin and Alderney, Ancelotti would be forced to invest his massive cash savings into bank accounts based in Switzerland. Additionally, Giovanni during this time led a massive crew that was headquartered out of Actor Alderney. In October of 1977, Junior Ancelotti, Giovanni Ancelotti, and Ancelotti family captain Freddie LaDusa would sit down at a longtime Ancelotti haunt, the Santa Maria Club on Emerald Street, which was now ran by Jimmy the Gravedigger Palazzolo. At this sit-down, Junior, Giovanni, and Freddie LaDusa would plan the murder of Liberty City Wrath wide receiver Willie Waltz after he had refused to participate in a point-shaving scheme. Just days later, Freddie LaDusa would order Ancelotti soldier Vinny Fat Lip Borsellino to carry out this hit. After Willie Waltz would be shot 4 times in the lobby of the Nickwas Hotel on Columbus Avenue, Waltz would survive, and both Freddie LaDusa and Vinny Fat Lip would be arrested by FIB agents only hours later. Following this, Giovanni Ancelotti, who had planned the Willy Waltz shooting with both Junior and Freddie Ledusa, was now under the suspicion that Junior could have been a rat all along. Junior, who had for years been called a rat, had eliminated anyone who perpetuated this theory, and despite Junior's lack of arrests, many of his adversaries and rivals over the years had either been whacked or sent to prison. And while Giovanni had long looked up to Junior, it was now becoming clear to Giovanni that Nicky Slick was right about Junior. By the end of 1977, Giovanni had ordered his crew to distance themselves from Junior Ancelotti, and soon Giovanni would begin to plot his move. In the early months of 1978, Giovanni Ancelotti would order two of his most trusted lieutenants, 47-year-old Paulie Matteo and 47-year-old Tony Battista, to begin regularly surveilling Junior Ancelotti, tracing his every move, in an attempt to find out if he was meeting with FIB agents. This task, which was extremely risky, would be carried out with intense caution, as Paulie Matteo and Tony Battista would be forced to use work trucks, stolen civilian cars, and even physical disguises to surveil Junior. After several uneventful weeks of sitting on Junior Ancelotti, watching him drive back and forth from Alderney to Lower Algonquin, meeting with various friends, associates, and business partners, Junior would be spotted in March of 1978, meeting with what appeared to be FIB agents inside of a warehouse at the Francis International Airport in Dukes. Following this, as Paulie Matteo and Tony Battista would pass this information on to Giovanni, Giovanni would become livid and would swear to take vengeance against Junior. However, as this was transpiring, Junior was in the midst of another crisis. During the early months of 1978, Junior had developed a strained relationship with his FIB handlers. Junior, who had lied to FIB agents throughout his years of cooperation, was now being threatened with prosecution by the FIB for various crimes he had covered up to benefit himself. As a result of this, Junior would now regularly become belligerent in his meetings with his handlers, yelling at them, cursing them, and even threatening them. By March of 1978, Junior, in a meeting with his FIB handlers, would demand that several agents be fired, threatening that he would release various top government secrets that he had become privy to while working with the FIB, including information regarding corruption, alien life, and trafficking rings. Then, on an early morning in May of 1978, as Junior Ancelotti walked out onto his Caribou Avenue stoop to fetch his morning paper, Junior would be struck in the heart with a sniper's bullet. Just shortly after, the 47-year-old Don of the Ancelotti crime family, Carlo Ancelotti Jr., would be pronounced dead at the scene. Junior's funeral, which was held at the Columbus Cathedral in Algonquin, while crowded, was not attended by any members of the Mafia in Liberty City, as the word of Junior's informant status was now spreading in the street. While Junior's death was described in the media as a gangland execution, many within the Ancelotti family believed it had been the work of the United States government. Following the death of Junior Ancelotti, the now 48-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti, who had the respect of powerful commission members like Pavano family Don, Charlie Valvona, would soon be unanimously considered the new Don of the Ancelotti crime family. Around this time, Giovanni would promote powerful broker-based Ancelotti captain, 70-year-old Gino Garlic Breath Generoso as the family's new underboss, and 53-year-old Vito Ancelotti as the family's consigliere. As the Ancelotti crime family went into the 1980s, Giovanni Ancelotti would attempt to create a resurgence of his family, as the poor leadership of past bosses, like Carlo and Carlo Jr., had rendered the Ancelottis as the weakest of the Liberty City Five families. Despite this, the various Ancelotti street crews were still bringing in major earnings through their heroin connection with the triads in Chinatown. Ancelotti, during this time, who hadn't been charged with a crime since 1960, would urge his family to keep a low profile from the FIB and avoid unnecessary attention in the media, something Giovanni's allies in the Pavano family had perfected. During the year 1980, Giovanni Ancelotti would begin to open the books and begin making new members. This would include former high-ranking East Holland Purple Gang member, 42-year-old Carlo the Rock Boccoli, and several members of Boccoli's crew. Carlo the Rock Boccoli, who had long worked for East Holland Ancelotti gangsters like Nicky Slick Lombardo and Bucky Alonso, would soon put together a gambling ring based in East Holland that would make him one of the top earners in the Ancelotti crime family. Also inducted during this time were rising Alderney gangsters, 34-year-old Alphonse Alley Boy Garone and 32-year-old Charles Chubby Charlie Matteo, both sons of high-ranking Ancelotti gangsters. In 1982, Ancelotti family captain Jimmy the Gravedigger Palazzolo would be pulled over in Varsity Heights with an unregistered firearm and an 8-ball of cocaine. Following this, Palazzolo would be sentenced to 2 years in Liberty State Correctional Facility. By 1983, longtime Canadian Ancelotti figure Enrico Ancelotti would die from natural causes at the age of 80. With the death of Enrico Ancelotti, the Ancelotti's Canadian presence would now be largely defunct, despite rumors of ongoing Ancelotti operations in the Great White North. Also in the year 1983, Giovanni Ancelotti would induct another rising gangster into the family, 30-year-old Anthony Tony Black Spoleto. Tony Black Spoleto, who grew up in an apartment on Feldspar Street in Little Italy, was a nephew of the late Tony Bones Licavoli, known as a tough and intelligent young recruit, involved in gambling, loan sharking, and mass extortion. Soon, Tony Black would go on to lead a younger generation of Ancelotti gangsters in Lower Algonquin. By 1984, Tony Black Spoleto had taken the Ancelotti family's Lower Easton crew from a washed-up group of elderly crooks to one of the most prominent gambling crews in all of Algonquin. By this point, Tony Black and his well-organized crew would develop highly lucrative underground poker games, based out of the Lower Easton and Little Italy neighborhoods in Algonquin. Additionally, Tony Black's brother Michael Spoleto was known to control a sportsbook that spanned throughout the Liberty City metropolitan area. Additionally, the Spoleto crew during this time was making millions shaking down and extorting many construction companies, insurance companies, and many of the wealthy stock traders in the exchange section of Lower Algonquin. While Spoleto was flying high during this time, it was unbeknownst to Spoleto that he had rats in his inner circle. By 1985, 2 confidential informants from the Spoleto crew, Sal Castiglia and Bruno Diamante, had began working with the FIB and cooperating against Tony Black Spoleto. As a result of this, Tony Black Spoleto and his right-hand man, Frankie Barzini, would both be taken down in September of 1985 in a federal racketeering case. In October of 1987, the FIB would launch a massive takedown dubbed the Chinese Connection. In this takedown, FIB agents would raid several warehouses in the Algonquin fish market where more than 12,000 pounds of China white heroin would be recovered. Additionally, more than 24 pizzerias would be raided from Liberty City to Carcer City that had been used as fronts to deal large quantities of heroin. The same night, several Liberty City triad leaders in Chinatown would be arrested and threatened with life imprisonment for their charges. Among those arrested was the now 73-year-old Johnny Wang, who would suffer a fatal heart attack while being questioned at the FIB headquarters in Easton. Also arrested in the Chinese Connection were several high-ranking Ancelotti family figures, including 68-year-old Bucky Alonso, 62-year-old Vito Ancelotti, and 56-year-old Tony Batista, as well as several members of the Carcer City crime family. Soon, as several informants would pop up in the case, Bucky Alonso, Vito Ancelotti, and Tony Batista would be sentenced each to 50 years in prison for drug trafficking. By 1989, the now 81-year-old Ancelotti family underboss, Gino Garlic Breath Generoso, would die from natural causes at his Onondaga Avenue home. Following this, the Ancelotti family's broker presence would now be officially defunct. It was around this time that Giovanni Ancelotti would promote his right-hand man, 58-year-old Paulie Matteo, as both the underboss and consigliere of the family. During the early 1990s, as changing racial demographics would render the East Holland neighborhood unlivable, many of the Ancelotti soldiers in East Holland, now led by Carlo the Rock Boccoli, would begin to relocate to Alderney, particularly in the Italian-American stronghold of Bircham. By this point, the Ancelottis had become a family that was primarily based out of Alderney, rather than Liberty City, despite them maintaining prevalence down in Little Italy. In 1992, high-ranking Ancelotti soldier Tony Black Spoleto would be released from prison after serving 7 years for racketeering. Upon the release of Spoleto, Spoleto would be made a captain over his own crew in Algonquin. In 1993, Giovanni Ancelotti would order the Spoleto crew to take out longtime Ancelotti captain Jimmy the Gravedigger Palazzolo. This was a result of Palazzolo's increasingly bizarre behavior and lack of respect. In July of 1993, Palazzolo would be shot 6 times in a drive-by outside of the Santa Maria Social Club on Emerald Street, killing Palazzolo at the age of 65. Just weeks later, Tony Black Spoleto, who was now running the Santa Maria Social Club, would relocate the club from Emerald Street to a newly renovated storefront on the corner of Columbus Avenue and Garnet Street. By this point, Tony Black Spoleto was the sole controller of the Ancelotti family's Algonquin presence and considered the family's most respected captain. By 1995, Giovanni Ancelotti's vice city overseer, the now 80-year-old slow Tony Giannetti, was now blind, senile, and moving into retirement from the street life. It was around this time Tony Black would fly down to Leonida to establish territory and spread his operation. In 1997, Giovanni Ancelotti and broker businessman Bruno Lasordo would open a popular bar and restaurant in the Leonida Keys called Wise Guys Ristorante. Not long after, Ancelotti would purchase a luxurious home in the Leonida Keys, where Ancelotti and his family would live during the winter months. Soon, Giovanni and Tony Black would control large-scale loan sharking and gambling operations in both Visadale County and Mariana County, with the Keys as their base of operation. In 1999, when actor-based Ancelotti captain, 73-year-old Chucky Garone would suffer a heart attack while having sex with a prostitute, Giovanni would appoint powerful actor-mobster, 51-year-old Charles "Chubby" Charlie Matteo, as captain over the family's actor crew. As the Ancelotti crime family went into the 21st century, they were existing in a time far removed from the days of Jack Ancelotti. With security cameras, cell phones, less privacy, increased FIB presence, and DNA technology, it was now harder than ever to thrive as a mafia family. By this point, the Ancelotti family was now the smallest and weakest out of the Liberty City 5 families, and would now often be forced to use outside groups like the Chinese Triads, the Albanian mob, and Jamaican street gangs to outsource their activities. Despite this, with powerful Ancelotti captains on the street like Tony Black Spoleto, Chubby Charlie Matteo, and Carlo the Rock Baccoli, the Ancelottis would be able to maintain a presence in the city. In 2001, Chubby Charlie Matteo would be hemmed up on a small-time sports gambling case based out of Alderney, and after being released, Matteo would skip bail and begin living on the lam in Port Tudor, Alderney. With Matteo on the lam, Giovanni would soon promote actor-based powerhouse, 55-year-old Alphonse "Ali Boy" Garone, to run Matteo's day-to-day operations around actor. In 2003, when Ancelotti family underboss, 72-year-old Paulie Matteo, would be charged with federal racketeering charges, Matteo would flip and begin to cooperate against the Ancelotti crime family. Subsequently, the now 73-year-old Giovanni Ancelotti would be arrested at his home in Actor and hit with racketeering charges, as well as murder charges, for his role in ordering the 1993 murder of Jimmy Palazzolo. Soon, Giovanni, who was now one of the city's most wealthy mob figures, would hire top Liberty City attorney Jonathan Hickey to represent him at trial. By 2004, after a year-long trial, Ancelotti would be found guilty of racketeering for his overseeing of the extortion of several stock traders in the exchange. However, despite turncoat Paulie Matteo's testimony, Ancelotti would be found not guilty of the Palazzolo murder due to a lack of evidence. Ultimately, in this case, the elderly Giovanni Ancelotti, who was now known on the street simply as the Old Man, would spend less than a year in Alderney State Correctional Facility before being transferred to house arrest at his home in Actor. Around this time, Tony Black Spoleto would begin outsourcing much of his muscle work to an Irish gang from Dukes known as the McReary crime family. The McRearys, who were ran by brothers from Meadows Park Dukes, Gerald and Packy McReary, despite being considered small-time, were capable gangsters, known to carry out beatings, shootings, drug deals, robberies, and debt collections on behalf of Tony Black and the Ancelottis. During the year 2007, the Ancelottis, who now were dominating certain areas of Alderney, would come into rivalry with the Alderney crime family, led by 51-year-old mobster from Westdyke, James Pegorino. By 2008, Pegorino would hire the McCreary crime family to take out high-ranking Ancelotti captain, Tony Black Spoleto, in an attempt to weaken the Ancelottis and cause a rift in their connection with the Albanian mob. Subsequently, Tony Black, after a meeting with the Albanians, would be blown up in a car bomb explosion at the Northwood Fuel Depot in uptown Algonquin. Not long after, one of Tony Black's top lieutenants, 31-year-old Frankie Garone, would be gunned down while riding his motorcycle in Algonquin, in a hit that was meant to look like it was carried out by Albanians. Following this, the Ancelottis would cease involvement with the Albanians and would name Tony Black's younger brother, 51-year-old Michael Spoleto, as the new captain of the Lower Algonquin crew. Just weeks later, more drama would emerge for the Ancelottis when members of the McCreary crime family would kidnap Giovanni's 31-year-old daughter, Gracie Ancelotti, holding her for ransom. Initially, when McCreary members contacted Giovanni demanding ransom, Giovanni believed this was one of Gracie's schemes to get money out of him and ignored the messages. However, when photos of Gracie Ancelotti in bondage were sent to Giovanni, Giovanni would realize the severity of the situation. After Gracie was held captive in a Leftwood Alderney apartment building for several days, Giovanni would arrange for two Algonquin club owners that owed him money to deliver diamonds to the kidnappers in an attempt to pay the ransom, and following this, Gracie would be returned home unharmed. Not long after this, the feud between the Ancelottis and Pegorinos would once again flare up, when powerful Ancelotti family underboss, 60-year-old chubby Charlie Matteo, who had been successfully living on the lam around Port Tudor since 2001, would be killed when a Pegorino family hitman would shoot down Matteo's helicopter in Port Tudor. Following the many key Ancelotti figures taken out during the year 2008 and the humiliation that followed the kidnapping of Giovanni Ancelotti's daughter, the Ancelotti crime family had been significantly weakened by this point. However, the Ancelottis would remain a prominent force on the street into the 2010s. While Giovanni Ancelotti is no longer alive, and the Mafia is now a shell of its former self, the Ancelotti crime family is still currently active in Liberty City, and considered by the FIB to be heavily involved in gambling, loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, prostitution, and political corruption.